So let's talk through every single Space Marine unit in the core codex and talk about how I'd field them to get the most out of them in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and for this one I thought we'd do a rather big and high effort video. For this one, let's talk through every single datasheet in Codex Space Marines. The only ones I'm going to leave out for this one are the special characters that can only be taken by one given chapter. Maybe consider this one part 1 of 2, I'll do those in the next one hopefully. In this one though, I thought we'd go through the Space Marine units and talk about effective ways to put them on the tabletop, maybe focusing a little bit less on overall unit strength and just making the best out of each squad. Talking a little bit about unit size and how many of them you might want in an army, any Wargear selections they might have, what support options are worth bringing for them, and a very rough battle plan of how I might use them in a typical game. I'll also do a very rough current power rating as well, that one's going to be kind of arbitrary. Obviously it's a really broad brush overview given how many chapters and detachments and ways to use these things there are. Feel free to let me know any other takes in the comments, but otherwise let's jump straight into it. We'll go through infantry first, then bikes, vehicles and characters in that order, so let's start with the standard Space Marines on the battle line with our standard intercessors. These guys are good for taking objectives with their sticky objective role and can do a bit of damage to enemy light troops with their bolt rifles, grenade launcher and power fist on the sergeant. I would likely just take them in small 5-man units. It usually makes sense to most of the time unless you're going for big power damage type squads, and likely in small numbers. There's a bit of diminishing returns on their sticky objective special rule to be able to mark points so that you continue to hold them even if you move off them. On the sergeant, I'd likely take a power fist and bolt rifle, and then the grenade launcher on one of the other random guys, seeing as you get it free. And as basic troops, I think I'd keep them very light in terms of support options. I feel like it'd be more the case that if you bought a character, it'd be them being a bodyguard for him as opposed to him buffing them. Otherwise, there's just so many more dangerous units that you can lead. For detachment things, I feel like they do pretty well in most of them, maybe particularly good with Anvil Siege Force given that they get heavy weapons. And in game I'd hope to put that sticky objective rule on the home objective, and then they could either loiter in the backfield, laying down a bit of fire support and repelling things from the deployment zone, or moving forward to take the fight to the enemy if the opponent doesn't have any way to threaten to get to your home objective. I currently rate them as usable rather than standout on the power rating. Definitely not a bad thing in an army list, but certainly not standout strong. Next up, we've got the Assault Intercessors, 75 points for 5 of these. These guys slam in with mass chainsword attacks that get reroll wounds on objectives, so they can be really quite savage for the cost, and they're pretty cheap for the objective control. For squad size, again I'd be typically tempted by 5-man units for cheap skirmishing troops. I think you could maybe go for squads of 10 if they supported certain characters, maybe if you were building around them as damage dealers, perhaps for armies like Blood Angels maybe. And again, for them, I'd go for a power fist on the sergeant, maybe a thunder hammer if you fancied it, and a plasma pistol for his offhand. Assault intercessors are interesting as they sort of buff characters as well as characters buffing them. The reroll wounds that they can get is pretty good for any standard Space Marine captains and things, and beyond that they're just cheapest, toughish infantry units with good objective control, so pretty excellent as a cheap character retinue. They absolutely love the Sons of Sanguinius detachment, now the Liberator Assault group, for the +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge. They do very well with captains or priests or both together, and otherwise can be good for characters that you just want on the board somewhere, like Uriel Ventris or Grandmaster Azrael. I feel like an Impulsor wouldn't be an awful choice if going with a character that's often used for the Blood Angels, and any stratagem that makes their melee a bit scarier, either lance melee or extra AP, such as you can get in Gladius, will be good use for them. For the battle plan, I'd usually have them escort a character into the mid-board and maybe act as a bit of a trading unit. If you're with Azrael, he probably wants to loiter back and generate some command points for a bit before pushing forward. Or otherwise, if you're just using them completely solo, likely just move up to the mid-board as a fairly expendable but surprisingly fighty Space Marine unit, and then hopefully jump out to take down a sort of middling enemy threat that they're probably not going to be able to handle the toughest stuff around. For current power, with combos with the right characters, I rate them kind of strong, particularly with those characters mentioned, maybe Ragnar Blackmane, or certainly for Blood Angels. Before we move on to the other 70 odd Space Marine units, I thought I'd just give a shout out to today's video sponsor, and that's Warhammer Combat Cards, who kindly agreed to sponsor a video, and were a helpful factor in me being able to justify spending quite so long making an enormous video review like this. Warhammer Combat Cards is a 40k themed mobile game. The idea is that you basically build up a deck of these cards and level them up by repeatedly battling against other decks. They fight in fairly short and punchy, short runs of battles are around about a minute or so, and you gain more resources to level them up in various different ways. The idea behind them was to be a reimagining of an old school Citadel card game coming from all the way back in the 1980s. Times have changed a bit since these old school Terminators were stomping around. And the design of the cards hasn't changed so massively since then. You build them in a deck with a points cost kind of similar to a 40k army. They have health, range damage and melee damage, and have a few other abilities that make the gameplay a bit more complex. Say for example, this Reaver gaining fear to make the unit opposing him attack less. In game you take a Warlord card that has an ability that buffs the rest in some way. For example, Abaddon the Despoiler gives you +7 damage to all your card attacks, then have a deck of up to 9 other cards up to the points limit, and then they fight 3x3. Attacking either at range and melee. There's a little bit of simple gameplay with matching up the right things against each other, but more of the strategy is sort of deck building and putting combos together, and then leveling them up to make those combos better. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and if you did fancy giving the game a go, there's a code Auspex to get 40 Blood Angels cards, plus some plasma and coins and things. I'll briefly cycle back to them once more at the end of the video with a few more pros and cons and discussion of it. Getting back to the many flavours of Astartes though, next up we have the Heavy Intercessors, 100 points per 5, and big chunky Space Marines with 3 wounds and toughness 6, and longer range bolt guns. In general again, as Marines best suited for taking and holding objectives and doing support sort of things, I'd be more tempted to go as a 5-man squad. Maybe an Anvil Siege Force you could try and make a 10-man unit work, as then their bolt rifles could get actually quite scary with the +1 to wound on the go. They don't really have any proper weapon options. Obviously the Heavy Bolter is an auto-include. I think for most people's army lists, they're probably better off left cheap. Minimal investments to secure objectives with a whole load of Gravis armor and objective control. As mentioned, they could maybe go in the Anvil Siege Force and perhaps do the combo with sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ from the Lieutenant, which is one of the scariest ways to field bolters in standard 40k right now, I think. They also perhaps seem a particularly good unit for Ironfather Phyros as well if you want to make him work in Iron Hands, getting a 5+ feel no pain and a good strong retinue for him. In game, I'd either be tempted to leave them on a home field objective as a slightly chunky objective holder, or depending on the army, they could potentially push up to the midfield and force the opponent to deal with the toughness 6 defensive profile, which maybe could just get a bit ignored if you sit them at home. They do have strong competitors for both those roles though, say infiltrators in the home field or more scary damage dealers going forward. They tend to be a bit niche in competitive lists. I still rate them as usable as opposed to weak though. Next up, we've got the tactical squad in our standard Firstborn Space Marines. You have to take a 10-man squad of them, and their special rule allows combat squads breaking into 2 5-man squads. I'd be most tempted to put the bolters in one cheap squad to do grunt work like hold a home field objective or be expendable screening bodies, and then have the heavy special weapon and sergeant being an unusually threatening 70-point unit, while still being kind of tough and good objective control for the cost. For the weapon choices, I'd like a power fist on the sergeant, probably a plasma or melter gun as the special weapon, and then a las cannon or multi-melter for the heavy weapon. Should mean that they can threaten some heavy infantry and lighter vehicles as well. If you went all in on the melter, perhaps they could combo with Vulcan Hestan for some rerolls, and the melters enjoy the Firestorm buffs of strength 10 as well. And they certainly could make use of a Rhino, potentially making it more threatening than usual, firing scary guns off the top of it. Despite all this, I'd still rate them on the weaker side of the Space Marine spectrum in Warhammer 40k right now. Not too terrible if you really want to make a unit of them work, but it feels like you're jumping through hoops to do so and lack a bit of synergy with some of the other things. It seems that for a lot of people, the cheap points per body is just kind of outweighed by the standard guys being not much threat with their bolters, and a sort of clunky way that you have to make use of 2 different units, either of which again might have its role done better by a different squad. Next up, we've got the Infernus Marines, the Pyre-blasting Space Marines from Leviathan. They've got Strength 5 Flamers at 12-inch range. For fielding them, again I'd generally be more tempted to run 5-man squads of them, or actually doing some sort of big damage combo with perhaps Vulcan Hestan and the Firestorm Assault Force. Otherwise though, it just feels like it's going to be overkill against infantry, and still not really quite enough to take down heavies. They don't have any Wargear options, they just get their Pyre Blasters each. And then for stratagem and unit support, 1 command point for Overwatch with a whole load of volume fire is one of the biggest draws to them. You can have them advance towards a midfield objective, and then threaten to barbecue anything that steps up to it. They'll love the Firestorm detachment for Strength 6 and the Assault keywords to get them a lot closer, and Torrent Devastating Wounds could be nasty for them too. And perhaps could be a good option to pile out of a Drop Pod Repulsor, or maybe even an Impulsor in the Firestorm detachment, to get them close and get them burning things. If you were just using a smaller squad of 5 though, I'd probably just move them up on foot towards the central objectives, and then if the opponent's got some things that are actually going to fear those pyroblasters, set them up where they can see every pointer on an objective marker, so as soon as the enemy moves up to take it, you can burn them down. Overall, I'd kind of rate them usable as opposed to standouts. Again, lots of competition for their role, and Space Marines tend to handle light infantry quite well anyway. Next up, we've got the Stern Guard Veterans. I feel like they're perhaps a unit that could work either as smaller or bigger units, perhaps bigger ones if you're running with a character to buff them in some way. They don't generally tend to be taken in any great numbers in competitive lists right now, just maybe a little bit jack of all trades and master of none. Though it's only 10 points more than intercessors and having quite a lot more threat than them, they never really feel like they're too terrible at any one job. For the Wargear choices, I'd be more tempted by the bolt rifles as they math out better against most targets, though the combis do have a bit of a niche against things like Terminator equivalents. I'd probably be more tempted by the heavy bolter and the power fist on their other upgrades. For the options for support, they get a little bit better with Oath of Moment, so it could be a tiny draw to use that with them, though not huge. They perhaps could be a good on-paper choice for Chief Librarian Tigurius as a threatening ranged unit, as he can't join Hellblasters, and they could justify investment in transports and things a bit more than others, maybe jumping out of repulsors or impulsors. For their battle plan, it could be fairly flexible depending on the opponent. Their damage is fairly general purpose with the devastating wounds, but also very swingy against tough stuff. If you roll a bunch of 6s, they could be unusually impactful. If you don't, then they won't. I think it'd be reasonable enough to send them fighting over mid-board objectives, ideally getting a couple of volleys of their boosted bolt guns into enemy infantry first, and hopefully getting the jump on the enemy rather than the other way around. As mentioned though, I'd say they probably limp into sort of usable tier, as their damage is alright and they're genuinely not terrible in combat as well with that power fist. If you want slightly higher investment Space Marine Tactica shooting though, a lot more people seem to go for Hellblasters. Next up, we've got the Company Heroes, a set squad of just 4 models that must join either a captain or chapter master, and for these guys it's often the choice between them or a slightly cheaper squad of assault intercessors if you want a unit that's going to escort the character but not really spend too many points on doing so. They don't get any Wargear options, coming with their champion with the power sword, banner, heavy bolter and bolt rifle veteran, and usually for their attached character it makes sense to guard something whose main focus isn't on buffing their own direct unit, maybe Uriel Ventris who gives us deep strike elsewhere, Vulcan Hestan who can do objective things, and Mark 1 targets for other units' melter weapons, or a few others like command point generators such as Marius Calgar. On the flip side, they're just really not that standout for regular captains, given that their free stratagems are best on big impactful units, and given that you're paying for their tankiness with the 4 wounds and -1 to wound built in, they're likely not going to need transports quite so much and can just march up on foot onto the mid-board objectives. That'd be how I'd be most tempted to use them, move up to a staging point in the mid-board and then step up to the objectives, ideally wanting to bully medium tier threats as opposed to going after the enemy's massive elites. Power-wise, I'd kind of rate them around about usable to strong, certainly feeling like the right choice for some characters, though weigh them up against assault intercessors. Next up, we've got the Blade Guard Veterans. In general, if you're taking them, it probably makes sense to have a maxed out squad of 6 of them and give them some sort of intimidating buffing character to take them to the next level. For certain chapters like Dark Angels and Black Templars, they tend to get outcompeted by their unique veterans, say Sword Brethren or Inner Circle Companions, but for regular Marines, they're the scariest damage dealers in Tacticus armor. For their Wargear choices, they get their damage to power swords and storm shields, and you may as well take their Neofolkite pistol. And for the Blade Guard, they're absolutely a unit that I would support with some kind of scary character. Maybe a standard lieutenant would be the most obvious and easy go-to. He can take a scary melee weapon and gives lethal hits, but otherwise they're a good choice for things like chaplains, captains, or Judasirs, and pretty great with some epic heroes as well. They do fine with Marnius Calgar, Adrax Agatone, or Ragnar Blackmane. If you are going for a big investment unit, it might make sense to deliver them out of a Land Raider or an Impulsor to make sure that they get there without getting shot up, as they are kind of slow on the board as well. Otherwise they get on well with quite a lot of the detachments. They quite like anything advanced and charged like Gladius, fairly scary with Sons of Sanguinius, and like extra AP when they can get it, maybe from Righteous Crusaders, and they are one of the units that works in the 1st Company Task Force as well. For their battle plan, I think they generally want to go to a big enemy threat in the middle of their army, one of their most important units, and kill it with power swords. Ideally, if they get a choice, they're going to be better at killing toughness 5 or below due to those power sword stat lines, and they could really struggle with any vehicles that are toughness 10 or higher, so if they get a choice, probably leave those to more dedicated anti-tank. Overall, I'd rate them solidly usable. Nice enough as a unit to build around, but maybe not crazily stand out for the cost. Next up, we've got the Space Marines with the scary plasma guns in the Hellblasters. For these guys, I feel like both small squads and bigger squads can work. Perhaps going for a big squad if you're going to do some sort of great big character combo with a lieutenant or fire discipline. Otherwise, small squads are fine if you're going more multiple small units. They all get their standard plasma incinerators with a chance to fire on death if they overheat or get slain by the enemy shooting. I think if you are supporting them with a character, then usually a standard lieutenant is probably the best bet. Lethal hits just make those plasma weapons so much more impactful against tough monsters and vehicles. Otherwise, Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels could be quite a good option. A nice mix of sustained hits and a 4+ invulnerable save. Uriel Ventris could deep strike them in, and maybe the Apothecary or Librarian could both have better value than most here, though I still feel like probably Lieutenant is the way to go for more standard Codex characters. Given they're quite expensive at 23 points per model, they really want to be getting the jump on the enemy, not the other way around. They could just foot slog, but would also work pretty well with transports like an Impulsor, where they could fire out of the top of it, or perhaps a Repulsor or Drop Pod. For combos, they can certainly make use of the Fire Discipline combo to great effect in Gladius with a Lieutenant. The heavy weapons could be relevant in Anvil as well, and a big Repulsor unit could have some fun with Firestormer. In general, in game, they want to be played with kind of carefully, aiming to get the first strike, and then ideally targeting something that's toughness 8 or less, which there's kind of little in the game that they won't do big damage to. Then ideally, if they can also stay out of melee and get shot down in the enemy shooting phase, the best thing to do with the plasma incinerators is often to try and finish off injured things or destroy things that are yet to strike. Maybe they get shot down and then the Hellblaster casualties mow down a bunch of guys that were yet to charge. For sheer power wise, I'd rate them kind of usable to strong, kind of hard to go too far wrong with really, and fairly intimidating to face, only really stand out damage against certain enemy units though. Next up, we've got the Devastators, heavy weapons of the Firstborn, and even if the last 5 Marines that you buy in are a bit cheaper, I still run them as nice small focus squads of 5. For their heavy weapons, the main ones I'd focus on would either be the Multi-Melters, Grav Cannons, or Las Cannons. All those are interesting enough profiles to get 4 of them in one unit. And then again, like the Hellblasters, the game plan's going to be to try and make sure that they get the first round of shooting, even if that means that they have to move. They're just a bit too expensive to have the enemy directly shooting at them before they've got to attack. They can work well with transports to that end. Maybe the Razorback feels like a particularly good one with the reroll wound rolls it can give. And Firestorm Assault Force along with a Razorback can be really quite a nice way of making multi-melters work. The Grav Cannon loadout can also get on nicely with Vanguard Task Force too. They particularly like the extra AP stratagem that you can get there. In any case, after they've hopefully gotten the first strike on something that they're good against, ideally they want to remain static and fire after that to get their +1 to hit from heavy. They feel like in general odds might be against them in just being able to stand still and shoot, given that they're going to be a big high priority target, as they're not really that tough to kill but really quite dangerous. In any case, in terms of overall power, I'd rate them as kind of usable right now, but maybe not standout. For infantry with big guns, people tend to lean towards the Primaris, or perhaps more often things like shooty tanks and dreadnoughts. Next up, we've got the Primaris missile launcher upon a missile launcher in the Desolation squad. They've got a big direct fire missile and one that fires indirect with a Vengor launcher on the Sergeant. They can only be running 5s now and cost a massive 200 points. As a result, I'd like to keep numbers of them low if you were fielding them. And for Wargear choices, I'd go for the Super Crack missiles as they're just far more value than the frag ones, and a Vengor launcher for the Sergeant, which feels like the best bit of kit in the squad. They can't be joined by all that many characters, and they're not really efficient for buffing a unit of 5 model Marines as well. For the most part, they don't really even have particularly great synergies either. Even Anvil isn't that much good for them, now they're capped at Ballistic Skill 4+ for indirect fire. I guess if you did want to get every bit of indirect fire out of them, you could combo them with Oath of Moment, I suppose, though that might be taking it away from more powerful direct fire options. Given they're paying quite so much for what they do, I want to start them on the board, firing out of line of sight for the first few turns, ideally trying to take down any enemy units that are just really quite fragile but very dangerous, or potentially going after bigger units of objective grabbers. Potentially if you take out one of those, it could cost them victory points, or force them to, say, hold a home field objective with something far more valuable. They tend to be best against lightly armoured things of toughness 3. Particularly if their Castellan launchers can get multiple hits with blast. Then later in the game, after a few turns of doing that, they'll likely want to step into direct fire and also use their Super Crack missiles as well. As towards the end of the game, it maybe matters a little bit less if they get killed if they've already done several turns worth of damage. In general though, they don't tend to get played in competitive lists currently. 200 points is just seen as far too much for what they'd bring. Next up, we've got the Eradicator Squad, slow-moving Gravis armor with melter weapons, and they get massive inbuilt rerolls against monsters and vehicles. For the squad size of them, both units of 3 and 6 can work fine. I feel like you could run multiple units in an army list if you wanted to, though likely not going crazily heavy on them, just because they're kind of great against tanks and monsters, but only a bit mediocre against everything else. They don't really have any Wargear choices besides multi-melters 1 per 3, which are kind of auto-includes. They do more damage on average, and then with a short range but massive damage potential, they are a good unit to have support for. Some people like to lead them with an apothecary biologist to grant them lethal hits and allow them to use enhancements like maybe fire discipline in Gladius. If you're doing that, I'd run them with a 6-man squad, and then they need some way to be able to deliver them into effective range. Maybe it could be okay for advance and shoot and just foot slogging in Gladius and Firestorm, though even then if your opponent wants to outrange them with their biggest tanks and monsters, then they might well be able to. I feel like it's a bit more reliable to put them in something like a Repulsor, have that move up the board, and you can drop them out, and then hopefully in effective range with the big guns. Against the right opponent, strategic reserves could work well as well, and if you were feeling aggressive with them, you could even think about rapid ingressing to try and get them within actual melter range, which takes their damage from pretty great to spectacularly so. Or you could use some chapter-specific teleport type things like Yuri or Ventress. They get on really well with Gladius with the advance and shoot, and they'll also love Firestorm as well with strength 10 melter at 12-inch range. And kind of like Vulcan Hestan too, given that he can give them rerolls against things that aren't monsters and vehicles. In general, their battle plan's really quite simple. In some way, get them to within 18 inches of tanks and monsters and get the first strike on them. Bonus points if you can actually get them within 9-inch melter range, but they're pretty effective either way. Then the opponent's likely to hit them back hard. If it's possible, then don't have them die on the first strike and don't get them tagged in melee, though it might not be possible, and you might change the way that you played them if you're against an entirely infantry-focused matchup. They can still be alright against heavy infantry, but they're going to be a much less critical unit if you don't have enormous tanks and vehicles to take down. In general, I'd rate them really quite competitive. One of the Space Marines' better tools for dealing with tanks. They're quite strong right now. Next up, let's talk through the jump pack unit, starting with the Vanguard Veterans. These guys are 105 points per 5, and I feel like where they're often played as a big 10 squad for sort of critical mass in melee, with mass amounts of attacks, and actually doing support things with characters, as opposed to going for smaller 5-man squads, where most people tend to prefer the jump pack intercessors. For their Wargear choices, they either get fancy pistols or storm shields, and they always get their relic weapons with their strength 5 AP1 and lethal hits on the charge. I'd probably go storm shields for the extra survivability when they get hit back. And then for unit support, a jump captain or chaplain I think is reasonable enough if you're only a 10-man squad. Even better though for things like Cave on Shrike for Raven Guard, giving them pseudo lone operative protection. And Blood Angels tend to get on pretty well with them in the Liberator Assault group. Massive increases in strength, potentially all the way up to strength 8 with a captain, is a big breakpoint. Otherwise, anything that can give them a bit more AP is kind of good, like the Gladius with their Lance stratagem. They can use first company things, and could maybe use grenades if they want a bit more damage against heavies, or rapid ingress if you want to jump them down from the sky and then get a near guaranteed charge. In game, I think their battle plan's usually going to be to jump from cover to cover and destroy something of sort of medium-ish threat in the enemy army. Their main weakness is that they can only really take down certain things particularly reliably. Ideally, they want to go for toughness 5 things or lower that don't have 2+ saves if there's targets like that available, as otherwise both their low strength and their low AP and damage can let them down against big tough monsters and vehicles and things. Overall, I rate them usable as opposed to strong. I feel like most armies will do better with jump intercessors for the cheaper points cost, though they perhaps can be good for things like Blood Angels and Raven Guard. Talking of jump intercessors, they're just 80 points per 5, so quite a bit cheaper, and for that you get 5 Space Marines with their mortal wound impact hits on the charge and a fair bit of fight. Typically I'd field them in small squads of 5 for the sort of skirmish action and objective kind of role, and it's really not too uncommon for Space Marine lists to spam these now. You could easily justify 3 units like that if you wanted to. And if you wanted to build a 10 strong squad, I don't think it's awful as well, maybe better for Raven Guard or Blood Angels though. For Wargear choices, I'd go Power Fist on the Sergeant to help with heavier stuff, and likely Plasma Pistols for the same sort of reason, though I have seen some people use Hand Flamers with them. And then for more normal purposes, I'd usually go minimal on support, just allow them to be cheap 80-point units that are really quite efficient at bullying lighter infantry units and scoring objectives. Again, they'll enjoy things like the Blood Angels Liberator Assault group, and could enjoy Gladius to be able to flex into that Lance stratagem if they really need the extra damage, and things like Black Templars and Space Wolves can get them some extra AP as well. Grenades and rapid ingress again are both possible. Maybe grenades could be nice if you're going to follow that up with a charge. You could be getting something like around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds on average, just out of a unit of 5 of them if you can do that. In general, my battle plan with them will be to do secondary objectives and actions, likely have some in reserve, drop down and do things that are needed, and otherwise just drop on the outskirts of the army and be ready to step up to skirmish with lighter things and maybe do secondary objectives later on. If they get the opportunity, ideally they want to get the charge as opposed to being charged themselves, and they can sometimes surprise people with the mortal wounds. You do need to be careful that they all actually get into engagement range if you want to maximise that, and often it won't be possible. Overall, they're really strong for Space Marines right now though. Lots of competitive lists including them, even ones that aren't really built around assault. Sticking with the jump packs, and next up we've got the suppressors. They're the Primaris with damage 2 autocannons that allow you to debuff an enemy unit with -1 to hit. You can only take them in squads of 3, and I feel like I'd probably keep numbers of them kind of low, maybe slightly diminishing returns after getting 1 copy of their special rule, and I feel like for their battlefield role they've got a lot of strong competition between jump intercessors and inceptors. They don't really have a lot of support options. They can't take characters. I guess for detachment type thingers, they could get on a bit better with thingers like Anvil, where occasionally they might be able to get the +1 to wound, or maybe Vanguard for being able to jump on and off the board. If I were using them, I'd be tempted to use them in a similar sort of way to the jump intercessors, have them off the board in deep strat reserve, and then when they drop in, they could do actions or secondary objectives, and also potentially, depending on what it is, they could light up the enemy with a bunch of autocannon fire as well, and can do their damage without having to worry about charging. The -1 to hit debuff can be kind of big against certain opponents as well. Maybe quite nice if the opponent's got some sort of big scary damage dealer like an enemy knight or similar, or maybe a big tank like an Astra Militarum Rogue or Dawn. I feel like with these guys it might pay a little bit to think 1 turn ahead as well, given that they can either shoot and hit on a 3+ or move and not both, which is a bit frustrating. Though it does mean that they do have quite a lot of options with how you play them. For current power, I'd rate them at kind of usable to weak. I think they've just got a bit too much competition from jump intercessors and inceptors for the battlefield role that they want to do. Plus their firepower is good against some targets but really bad against quite a lot out there. They are very easy to kill for the points cost as well. Next up we've got the Meteoric Descent Primaris from the sky with Inceptors. They get some nice close range twin-linked pistol fire, and also the ability to drop in just outside of 3 inches, so basically hurtling down virtually anywhere on the board. For the most part, people tend to use them in units of 3 for a more utility support role with objectives and things. Some detachments might encourage you to build units of 6, maybe with return to reserves options like Vanguard Spearhead or the Blood Angels Angelic Host. For the weapon options, their guns are really quite well balanced. The bolters better against Space Marines and lighter stuff. The plasma better against Terminators and Heavies. How good they are might depend on the matchup. And in general, I don't really think that they need a whole load of synergy and support, and are kind of good doing what they do virtually wherever. I guess with the premium on them dropping in, any damage dealer stratagems like the Firestorm, Crucible or Battle could help them out well enough. Occasionally rapid ingress could allow them to do some sort of weird power play in combo with that 3-inch drop, though it certainly has to be massively worth it when it's going to set you back 130 points and a stratagem. And as mentioned, they do quite like return to reserve things, being able to jump off the board if they survive and then use that 3-inch drop again. For the game plan, start them in reserves and then look for good opportunities to use the drop in turn 2 and turn 3. If there's relevant secondary objectives, they'll basically be able to guarantee doing them. Occasionally they might be able to sneak primary objectives if the opponent's not deployed centrally on them, or otherwise can just put a whole bunch of precision firepower and damage exactly where it's needed, say jumping into cover alongside an isolated enemy unit and destroying them, and then hopefully remaining safe for next turn. Overall, I feel like they're quite strong right now. At this points cost, they're a bit more of a luxury than they used to be, but I feel like they're rarely going to be an awful choice for a unit for that kind of secondary support role. Next up, let's take a look at some Phobos armor and scouts, and we'll start off with the Incursors. Phobos Armoured Marines that can scout into the midboard, have a fun haywire mine for some mortal wounds, and mark one enemy target for +1 to hit with the rest of the army's firepower. Their special rule's the best bit about these guys. I'd only use units of 5 as that gets you more copies of it, and probably just 1 squad of these per army unless you're just going very heavy on the gun lines. They do feel like they're a unit where they have diminishing returns. For their Wargear options, they don't really get any major choices besides their free stuff. And otherwise, I don't think they need that much support. They could use Armour of Contempt or Smoke to help them survive on a mid-board objective perhaps, or maybe grenades to back up some mortal wounds with their Haywire Bomb. I think the main synergy that they need is just to be alongside a gun line that'll appreciate the +1 to hit in some way, as otherwise they're going to be a bit wasted compared with other stuff. In general though, I'd start them at least kind of forwardish and use their scout move to push up towards mid-board objectives, ideally with a line of sight to something that they want to mark for the +1 to hit, and then hopefully combine that with some sort of firepower that was hitting on a 3+. It means that you can use Oath of Moment elsewhere to buff other damage. The damage output isn't all that much in themselves, but they'll happily bully Toughness 3 infantry and things, and can maybe do things like fighting over mid-board points and doing secondaries. Overall for strength rating I'd say they're usable enough right now, though maybe not standout. For their counterpart infiltrators, they get a 6+ feel no pain from the Helix Gauntlet, and most importantly get their deep strike denial to 12 inches, so nothing can drop particularly close to them. These guys tend to get fielded in units of 5 again once more, as if you have more of them then you can have that deep strike denial in different places in the board. Army lists often just taking 1 unit of them again, though sometimes stretching to 2, and they're an incredibly common competitive pick, usually tasked with using that 12-inch deep strike denial to stop enemies arriving reserves on your home field objective. In general, they will do that very well regardless of detachment and don't need lots of support beyond that. A few people enjoy using the Phobos Librarian as an acceptable enough leader. If you want to invest more points in them, then that can mean that you have a home field guarding squad that both denies reserves to 12 inches and also can't be shot outside of 12 inches, so just spectacularly safe and hard to deal with there. And otherwise, just for stratagems and things, Armour of Contempt and Smoke being able to just help them cling to life a bit more might be some of the most common ones to be used. In game, they can certainly be flexed depending on what the opponent does. If they've got deep strikers, teleporters, or other reserves, then probably just use them to guard a home objective. If they don't have anything like that, then you could use them in the mid-board, and then they're just a durable Astartes squad with a 6+ feel no pain that makes damage to weapons not as good against them, and they can be a bit of a trading unit that's a bit harder to kill than most, scoring primary and doing secondaries, and then probably fighting and dying on the front line. At the moment, they're very rarely going to be a bad unit to include for the Space Marines, though. Next up, we've got the Skullmasked Reavers, morale debuff Space Marines with a bunch of Strength 4 AP0 precision attacks that cost 85 points per unit of 5. I'd say for more normal use, I'd probably just go for units of 5 for them and keep numbers kind of small overall, as they're just really not considered a strong datasheet currently. For Wargear choices, I'd be more tempted by the Grav Shoots to allow them the option of deep striking. It could make sense to use them as a sort of secondary interference sort of unit, or at least have the option to be able to do that. Out of the two, I feel like both the blades and carbines are kind of fine. I might be a bit more tempted by the blades out of the two of them, as at least you get the AP1 pistol shots. Again, for supporting options, I like to keep things kind of cheap. Just use them to drop in, do objectives, and then take down any enemy infantry that they can, maybe causing some battle shock along the way if they are able to. I feel like if you wanted to do unusual things with them though, you could maybe use the Phobos Lieutenants to do an interesting move, drop and charge type thing with them. With his move, shoot, move ability, you can get some very short charges off. Otherwise, First Company can have an interesting enhancement that allows some casualties from battle shock, which might be worth it here. And for Space Wolves, you could field them as Hounds of Morkai, which might be better given the devastating wounds and anti-psycho shenanigans. In general, I'd use them to drop in and then skirmish with any Toughness 3 badly armoured infantry in the midfield, and if they can fight on midfield objectives, then perhaps they might occasionally trigger some meaningful battle shocks too. I feel like for their sort of interference unit role that can deep strike, I'd be more tempted by jump intercessors, as they can just deal a whole load more scary damage between a bit of AP and special weapons and plasma pistols and mortal wounds and things, not to mention they move faster. In general, they're considered one of the weaker Space Marine datasheets currently, a bit overcosted for what they bring, and even at the best of times their rules are a bit unreliable. They either need a bit more threat or a lower points cost, I think. Next up, we've got some camo cloaked snipers in the Eliminators. These are locked 2 squad sizes of 3. And again, I feel like you wouldn't want to overload on them. They're kind of competing with the battlefield role for things like scouts and infiltrators, the Space Marines that can set up in the midfield. I think their Wargear choices are fairly well balanced, and you could justify just about any of them depending on exactly what battlefield role you wanted to use them for. I think personally I'd be tempted to go for las fusils over the snipers currently, though in the right matchup the snipers could be handy, and I could kind of take or leave the Instigator Bolt Carbine. It does give them some pretty fantastic extra movement that sacrifices a bit of damage. I feel like more competitive armies would tend to take it, though it does change them from a kind of okay damage unit to quite a low output one. For a small unit with only 3 models in, I wouldn't go investing too much in stratagems or characters or anything like that. I guess certain detachments could give them some okay passive buffs, perhaps particularly Anvil Siege Force, which could make them a bit more threatening with heavy weapons. Las fusils with a +1 to wound are at least fairly scary. In-game, with a bit of ranged firepower and also being a cheapish infiltrating unit, they've definitely got options. Depending on the matchup, you could put them in the mid-board and just use them as a cheap and expendable frontline unit, but they don't really feel like quite as good for that role as scouts. or you can raise their firepower and have them sit and shoot if their firepower is going to be good in this matchup. Or you could maybe have them be a little bit less brave than scouts with deployment and have the option to move up very quickly with the instigator carbine, allowing a bit of move, shoot, move. Definitely kind of flexible, but not really all that much threat for the cost, and kind of easy to kill with just 3 bodies for 85 points. In general, they don't tend to get played as much as things like infiltrators or scouts right now. Speaking of which, next up we have the Space Marines Scout Squad, a cheap 65 point unit. They can take some fun Wargear, they can infiltrate, deploy up the board, and return to reserves. They're basically always fielded in units of 5, as that gets you more board control and more units to do actions. And again, they're just generally considered a very competitive Space Marine unit. You often see lists running anywhere between 1 and 3 units of them. They're rarely ever going to be a bad choice for such a cheap unit that can start up the board and do some reserve shenanigans. For their Wargear choices, I feel like the exact loadout actually doesn't matter crazy amounts. It's more the fact that they can be there and do a bit of damage to things. Maybe missile, sniper, chainsaw, and shotguns is a common loadout, though I have seen people vary literally every single bit of that in competitive lists as well. Again, they're going to be a cheapish unit that won't really want anything big in the way of support. They just want to be doing what they're doing, maybe occasionally using some grenades for a bit of extra damage, or perhaps using Armour of Contempt if it actually gives them a chance to survive on an objective. In general, I'd save the stratagems for bigger things though. For a battle plan, ideally you'd set them up on a mid-board objective out of line of sight if that's possible. Though if the opponent's got loads of scary scout moves or scary infiltrators of their own, you could use them as a screening unit to stop them coming at you. And then from there use them as a nice expendable skirmish and trading type unit. With 10 wounds they still need some focus to take them down, and hopefully the enemy has to kill them with something big and important, and then you can hit that unit back hard. You can also opt to return them to reserve at the end of the enemy turn as well, which could be really handy late game for scoring in particular. Could be a good option to get into their deployment zone if they have managed to survive the game so far. Overall, as mentioned, really hard to go wrong with, considered very, very strong right now. Next up, we've got the Primaris Aggressors, chunky but quite expensive warriors in Gravis armour, fighting with a bunch of twin-linked anti-infantry weapons and then twin-linked power fists in melee. Typically, if you're using aggressors, it tends to be as a central squad with some big support, as they're one of the units that can take buffs really quite well, but maybe aren't likely to have quite as much impact if you just run them completely unsupported in smaller units. For Wargear choices, I'd usually take the Bolt Storm over the Flame Storm, as it's kind of similar damage output but a longer range. The Flame Storm does give you the option of Overwatch and often tends to get preferred in Firestorm Assault Force as well, given the threat range syncing up quite well and access to that torrent devastating wound stratagem. For support options, the most common tends to be the Apothecary Biologist, really quite good value for lethal hits on a Bolt Storm unit. Again, they're one of the units that can use the Fire Discipline combo in Gladius, so potentially sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ with a stratagem. And they're a unit that can sometimes be used as an infiltrating one in Vanguard with the Blade Driven Deep enhancement. Marnie's Calgar can join them and often gets fielded with Blade Driven Deep and an Apothecary Biologist in Vanguard. And if you go in Flamestorm, the lethal hits doesn't matter quite so much, so you might be better off with a Gravis Captain. He often tends to get the nod in Firestorm. As slow moving and not enormously tough for the points, but also quite expensive and dangerous, transports tend to do well with them. Maybe a Land Raider Redeemer or another Land Raider pattern could be particularly stand out. And then depending on the detachment, they're often going to be one of the best targets for basically any damage buffing stratagems to make them hit with the absolute maximal impact. Ideally, however, they're getting there. In an ideal world, they want to use their firepower to size down some enemy lighter infantry, and then charge something tougher with the twin-linked power fist. Given all the firepower's twin-links though, they can certainly take chunks out of everything at range, and fine positioning of them when they get out of a transport can be pretty important, as it depends where their AP debuff goes on. With how much the whole combo costs though, they really need to be taking out something important in the enemy army. They do have enough damage to make a massive impact. For strength-wise, I'd rate them kind of usable to strong, probably stronger in certain detachments that can give them good support though, as opposed to just on pure datasheet strength. Next up, we've got the big and stompy armoured elite of the Space Marines in the Terminators. This one's the standard squad with Stormbolters and Power Fists, and strong defense with a 2+ armor save and 4+ invulnerable. In general, they're going to be a bit of a central damage dealer unit, but I feel like either 5s or 10-man squads could work fine, as even at their smaller points cost, you've still got 175 points of unit, which can be enough to be critical mass for a melee squad. In general, I tend to not go too heavy on them though. Compared with some, they're just considered a bit mid in terms of the strength capacity. For the Wargear choices, I'd likely go for Power Fists. I guess Chain Fists aren't awful if you know that there are going to be a bunch of vehicles out there in the meta that you're likely to face. And for the heavy weapon, I'd probably debate between the Cyclone Missile Launcher or Assault Cannon, My personal favourite being the Cyclone missile launcher for its couple of big strength shots. If you're taking Terminators, they're definitely a unit that you can justify having stratagems and characters for if you want to. Armour of Contempt's going to have abnormally good value on a 2+ save. Rapid Ingress could be nice with their Deep Strike to allow them to drop somewhere safe and then hopefully go on to get a reliable charge after that. You certainly could justify characters if desired. I feel like all the Terminator ones are kind of okay but not hugely stand out. For detachments, most of them can do at least something for them. They are kind of central for the first company, allowing them to potentially repeatedly teleport. Dark Angel's Deathwing could have them teleporting turn 1. And they do have some nice things with Gladius as well. All those Power Fists could make good use of that Lance and extra AP stratagem. For using a basic Terminator squad, I'd likely try and use them as a disruptive Deep Strike kind of unit, maybe dropping down or rapid ingressing on turn 2, potentially trying to tow onto an objective while they do so, maybe being able to land there and then try and make a charge, so if they fail they're at least on the objective. Ideally, if they get the opportunity out of the strike, then Stormbolters should be able to kill some light infantry, and then hopefully go after something more powerful and impactful with the Power Fist after that. And then compared with the vast majority of Space Marine units, they should be harder to take down, so it should be something for your opponent's army to chew on that they can't really ignore too much, and hopefully some other things in the army go by unscathed. For datasheet power, I'd say they're usable enough, but maybe tend to be better in more casual games than hyper-optimized ones. Typically people tend to build around other units where the skew is a bit more towards damage than defense. I suspect another small points cut or some sort of boost to their abilities wouldn't be a bad idea from Games Workshop. Next up, we've got the Assault Terminators, the close combat variant either with Lightning Claws or Thunderhammers. Again, I could happily go for either 5s or 10s of these guys, and for the Wargear choice I'd go for Thunderhammer and Storm Shield out of the two. The Lightning Claws aren't terrible, but while they're the same points cost, I'd rather have the extra wound per model plus the ability to threaten heavier stuff. Otherwise they're kind of similar to the regular ones. If going hammers and shields, they've got even better defense per point and can get a bunch of devastating wounds out of those hammers. A chaplain could be fun to give them +1 to wound and a bit of protection against mortal and devastating wounds. And they perhaps feel like a unit that's particularly stand out for the Black Templars as well. They can flex into an anti-psych vow when needed to get devastating wounds on a 4+, and a big unit of 10 of them with 4 wounds apiece and the 5+ feel no pain from Tannhauser's bones could be a really chunky squad to remove if you wanted to use that combo. Again, I might be tempted to deep strike them depending on the army, and you could rapid ingress them to try and make melee. They also wouldn't be the worst just foot slogging towards a midfield point and forcing the opponents to either deal with them or back off a lot. With their defensive stat lines, they've got enough chunkiness that they can take and receive hits quite well. Again, I'd rate them more on the usable sort of scale of Space Marine units as opposed to stand out strong though. Next up, we've got yet bigger armour with the Centurion exosuits. These guys have got toughness 7 with a 2+ save and 4 wounds, and this one's the Assault Centurion version of them with big siege drills with damage 3 against vehicles and sustained hits, massive damage output if they can get close. I'd likely field these guys in squads of 3s due to it already being a big investment unit that's got a good chance of tearing down whatever they contact in close combat if they can get there. And for Wargear choices, I'd take the Centurion bolters on the chest weapon, and then for the secondary guns I could kind of handily go for flamers or melter guns, maybe a slight preference for melter if you have gone the bolters on the chest. Perhaps even more so than the Terminators, Armour of Contempt is pretty great on them given they've got a 2+ save, and they also don't have an invulnerable as well. It could mean that they could be very hard to remove if you can get cover on them and then trigger that stratagem. Then otherwise the main challenge is trying to get them close and into melee. Probably the best option could be a Land Raider, and you can fit 3 of them in the standard Land Raider as well. Could be a pretty scary and at least fairly cheap units to put in there, at least compared with the big character combos that you could. They don't have any character choices, but I guess you could use Uriel Ventris to allow deep strike and rapid ingress. He tends to be far more commonly used with Devastator Centurions though. Otherwise, anything that allows advance and charge like Gladius could be a big deal for them, helping with their slow speed and knowing that the opponent can't just back away and keep away from melee from them if they want to. For how I'd be tempted to field them, I'd likely use a Land Raider to deliver them into melee, ideally against a big monster or vehicle or some 3-wound infantry failing that, chipping in with some shooting on the way and then just trying to do as much damage as possible, and they're likely going to get counter-attacked hard. Hopefully should have a good chance of killing their points cost pretty quickly though if they can get into something important. Overall I'd rate them as a usable datasheet as opposed to stand out strong. Maybe it's a little bit less option for big scary synergies than some of the other central units that can take leaders. Next up we've got the Devastator Centurions. These guys are a similar deal except they get twin las cannons and missile launchers on the chest, plus some big rerolls against things on objectives. For their squad size, if you were fielding them normally, I'd usually go for units of 3s, as that's already really quite a big investment at 185 points. Maybe you could go up to a big unit of 6 if you were supporting them with Yuri or Ventress in Vanguard. As mentioned, I'd likely go for the las cannons and missile launchers. I feel like that's got the best overall threat. Really quite nasty against big tanks and vehicles with twin-linked las fire. And the missile launchers can be at least fairly general purpose against elite infantry, given that they get blast. For support things, as mentioned, Yuri or Ventress and Vanguard can be kind of great. Their main weakness is that they can only move 4 inches, so might struggle to get lines of sight on things. And in that one it means that you can deep strike them, so draw a guaranteed bead on something turn 2, or even just start them on the board and use the return to reserve stratagem anytime it looks like they don't have a good target to fire at. It means that you could essentially have them warping around the board in Vanguard if you invest a few command points, which is pretty terrifying given their damage output is great and their main weakness is low speed. Otherwise beyond that, anything that can speed them up will be handy, advance and shoot detachments like Firestorm or Gladius maybe. Otherwise, for a more standard battle plan than Vanguard, they'd generally just be more backfield fire support, likely hiding behind terrain and then being able to move into line of sight and take down some tough enemy armour. And if they can do so while maintaining a cover save, they could be hard to take down, at least for anything that doesn't have super high AP, and particularly if you use Armour of Contempt for them. They also really need to think about being screened as well, as they don't have any way to fall back and shoot or fire in melee. Being locked up in close combat could be bad news for them. Overall, in general, I'd say they're usable, really strong fire support, with the main weakness that they can't move as fast as the tanks, going to strong if you use that specific combo in an Ultramarines Vanguard. Next up, we're on to some mounted and artillery units, and first up we have the standard bikers in the Outrider squad. 80 points for a unit of 3 Primaris, pretty chunky for the points with 4 wounds at toughness 5, and then a bunch of strength 4 and AP 1 chainswords and bolt shots. They typically tend to get run in units of 3 as a more utility unit, and you might want to weigh them up against jump intercessors for the same role. I'd argue that Outriders might be a bit tougher, but they do have downsides like no deep strike and not being able to fade through walls and things, and not being as strong damage against tougher stuff. For their Wargear choices, I'd field ATVs solo if you want to take one along, as opposed to just throwing them into the same unit as you can here. And then for support options, I'd keep things minimal. If you really wanted to, you could do a 6-man squad with a chaplain to make them a bit more dangerous, both at range and in melee. But overall, I just don't think that that's really worth it versus investing in things that are more natural big damage dealers. For small units, they might be able to make use of things like grenades for a little bit of extra damage against isolated combats where it could tip the balance. And for detachments that give them good support, the Stormlance Task Force does have some powerful stratagems that could work on them, things like the -1 to hit and wound 1. Though unfortunately it does seem to work out far better for Space Wolf Thunderwolves, and Dark Angels could get them some support in their Ravenwing company of hunters. They are competing against Black Knights with a bunch of plasma there though. For using small skirmish squads, I likely deploy them on the flanks and try and move up from cover to cover, using their big turbo boost moves to get there if needed. Maybe skirmish or bully, or just tie up enemy units that they can threaten. And it's just handy to have A6 objective control units that can move really quickly to contest or take points, and maybe zoom around to do secondary objectives where they're needed to. Overall, I'd rate them as usable enough. Definitely competition for their small unit kind of role though, with jump intercessors in particular, and a bunch of cheaper units that move slower. The Invader ATV is basically the Primaris Mario Kart buggy, 70 points for an 8-wound mounted unit, with some twin bolt rifles and a big gun on top, and the ability to do one of those return fire things if people shoot mounted units nearby. You can only take them as single model units, which seems kind of good anyway for their cheap skirmish and sacrificial kind of role. And after the 2 big guns, I'd likely go for the multi-melter to make it a little bit more of a general purpose threat, perhaps being able to offer an elite infantry or 2. For the small unit role, I wouldn't focus too much on support options. I guess maybe in the situation that it's just trying to cling to life or an objective for victory points, Armour of Contempt could be okay, but I feel like if it's exposed to major enemy threats, it's not going to save it, and could have a bit more of a bonus if you are running near other Space Marine Outriders, maybe with a small chance to trigger its reactive shooting. My plan for it will be similar to the Outriders, lightly deployed on the flanks and moving from cover to cover, dealing a bit of damage if it can, but mainly focusing on moving towards objectives, screening, and doing secondary objectives, maybe doing the odd nuisance charge if it makes sense to. At 70 points for the model, I do feel like it's a bit on the weak side really. I think it'd be a bit more tempting at 65 or 60. I'd just be far more tempted to upgrade to jump intercessors or even Outriders for the 10-point extra. They just feel like they do its role quite a lot better. Next up, and for the Space Marine Artillery, we've got the Fire Strike Servo Turret. Technically a vehicle keyword unit. They move very slowly and can provide some fire support. You can have up to 2 of them per unit if you want to, and they overwatch on a 4+. If you do want to make them work, I feel like either one of them or 2 is kind of fine. For 1, it can be a fairly cheap sacrificial sort of unit that's a bit of an annoyance to the enemy that they don't want to focus on too much. For 2 of them, you might just about limp into being able to justify using Overwatch on them. And after their weapons, I'd go for the Las Talons. They just feel like a lot more threats than the twin autocannon loadouts. They've got 2+ saves, so could do okay with Armour of Contempt if they are shot at, particularly if they get cover. They'll enjoy advance and shoot detachments, which could actually make them a little bit more mobile. They move 3 inches, but 3+ d6 could get them some more lines of sight. And as mentioned, Overwatch on a 4+ could be kind of big with 4 Last Talon shots. There's a good chance that that could do something meaningful, particularly against the right target, like a damaged vehicle or similar. As mentioned though, I feel like you'd normally have wanted to invest in a big unit of 2 of them if you are going to make that work. For their battle plan, I feel like the standard way would be to use them as at least a fairly safe backfield firebase, ideally towing into cover for a cover save on that 2+ armour, chipping away at enemy lighter vehicles or heavy infantry with big last shots. Depending on the matchup, you could think about using strategic reserves to get line of sight, even if they won't be moving crazily fast after they've done that. But I think for a lot of Space Marine armies, they're just going to pass these up versus tanks that have similar firepower and defense but move far faster. I feel like these guys needed to hit a bit harder in their shooting phase if they really wanted to outcompete the vehicles despite their disadvantages. Speaking of vehicles though, let's move on to some Dreadnoughts and tanks, and first up we have the standard Firstborn Dreadnought. Not quite as tough or as many wounds as the big Primaris ones, 1 heavy weapon in one arm and a melee weapon in the other, plus a reroll 1's aura for nearby infantry. In general, I just lightly feel the 1 per army due to the special rule maybe being the most valuable bit for it. If you strip that away, then otherwise it's just not particularly powerful on any front. If you use it as a dedicated gun turret, it might be twin las cannons and missile launcher, which isn't nothing but far less firepower than you'd get, say, out of a Predator tank or a Ballistas Dreadnought. And as a result, I'd probably go for a single melee weapon and then a heavy weapon of your choosing in the other arm, probably a las cannon or multi-melter. In general, I wouldn't really bother with support for the Dreadnought itself, it's just not really all that much damage versus bigger vehicles. It'd be more about the Dreadnought supporting some notable infantry things, maybe a bunch of Hellblasters in a firebase if you were using them. Though even then I feel like its rule has got a bit of overlap with Oath of Moment, which practically you might want to be using if you do have a big Space Marine infantry firebase. I guess like the rest of the Dreadnoughts though, it can make good use of Armour of Contempt with its 2+ save. For a rough battle plan, I'd aim to stay in the centre of a formation of infantry for a bit of rerolls and chip in with its own heavy weapons, then perhaps towards the later game move up to the mid-board and put its melee profile to good work. With only 6-inch movement, it's probably not likely going to catch things that don't want to be in melee, but hopefully could do a bit of counter-charging perhaps. Unfortunately for its points cost, it is just kind of weak. I think it could go down by a good 20 points or more really. Just not really very well balanced versus either the other Dreadnoughts or the other armour. For his equivalent as the big chunky Primaris Dreadnought, we have the Redemptor. Lots more wounds at toughness 10 with a 2+ save, and also getting -1 damage baked in. He is hard to kill, even for the 210 points. For Wargear, most tend to go for the higher AP, big damage Macroplasma versus the heavy Onslaught, and then have a regular Onslaught Gatling Cannon in the offhand, and maybe Storm Bolters for the chest weapons. I feel like running multiple of these isn't a particularly terrible idea as a bit of a central power unit that people are going to struggle to deal with. Maybe more so in Ironstorm than elsewhere though. For buffs and support, I feel like he's reasonable enough to support with the Tech Marine if he wanted to. He does have quite a bit of firepower, and those wounds are quite hard to chip off, so healing them is nice. As with the rest, he'll make good use of Armour of Contempt. He enjoys Ironstorm for the rerolls on the Macroplasma, plus the other options it can bring, and does fine in Gladius with the Advance and Shoot and Advance and Charge options. As a big, scary and high investment vehicle, he's going to do well with just about any of the damage and defensive style stratagems. For a game plan, I'd usually just have him marching up the board, maybe being a better unit to tank enemy firepower than some in the Space Marine armory. Ideally using the Macroplasma to hunt heavy infantry or lighter vehicles, with the small arms chipping in against lighter stuff, and then following up with a charge when it makes sense to, ideally against something fairly tough. If you can tow into cover, then it's a good idea to, given the 2+ save and the possibility to stack it with Armour of Contempt. Currently I rate him as fairly strong for the Space Marines, though maybe not standout so at 210 points. In general I think he's a big power unit that you can't go too far wrong with though. Next up, we've got the Brutalis Dreadnought, 160 points, so 50 less than the Redemptor, though you don't get a big gun with him, and he doesn't get the -1 damage rule, which means that his durability per point is kind of similar overall. For his Wargear selections, I'd go for the multi-melters over the heavy bolters, particularly with twin links, and I'd be more tempted by the talons over the fists. I think it's just a bit better to have the higher AP sweep profile in melee, just to guarantee that he's not going to get bolted down with hordes of 1-wound infantry. If you're using them, I probably wouldn't spam them, maybe just one in a list or two at a push, perhaps some slightly diminishing returns with which movement lanes they can go down, and not wanting to get in each other's way. For support options, it's maybe kind of similar to the Redemptor. I'd be a bit less tempted by things like Tech Marines, as they're going to struggle to keep up as he's trying to make combat. Again, Armour of Contempt's good value on him, and I feel like Gladius Task Force is maybe unusually good for him. Being able to advance and shoot, and then advance and charge in different turns are both going to be really impactful. Depending on the enemy army, you could also think about Strategic Reserve as an option to have him jump in at the side of the board as a massive threat your opponent can't ignore. He could be an option for rapid ingress that way, turn up in the enemy turn, and that's a lot of Dreadnought armor to take down, and if not, then something's getting charged and hit very hard. In general, his game plan's going to be super simple, kind of needs to just rush up the board and make opponents deal with all that 2+ save, ideally getting the charge himself rather than the other way round to get the mortal wound impact hits that he gets. And again, it might be worth sacrificing a little bit of movement to tow into cover, just to reduce a bit of that incoming firepower. Overall, I'd rate him usable as opposed to stand out strong. Lastly, for the main Redemptor variants, we've got the recent Ballistus Dreadnought, 2 big missile shots that you can swap out for a frag mode, and backed up by 2 las cannon shots, getting some inbuilt rerolls against stuff that are full strength. He doesn't get any Wargear options, and I feel like if you are running them, it's not awful to take more than one of them. The main risk with the Ballistus Dreadnought is that it tends to be kind of tanky but sort of low on the damage output front versus some other things, and maybe runs the risk of just being ignored in favour of the enemy going after the rest of the army before they bother to deal with them. For this one, I'd say that he needs very little support with his inbuilt rerolls. As a more backfield long-range fire support gun turret, he could make good use of Vanguard as well as Ironstorm things. Getting stealth and cover at that long range means that he's going to be even trickier to take out, and like the rest of the Dreadnoughts, he'll get on well with Armour of Contempt. I'm not sure that Tech Marines are all that necessary given the inbuilt rerolls against a bunch of tough stuff. I feel like it's maybe not the optimal unit for them to support. For a game plan, he just wants to loiter in the home field, ideally getting lines of sight while remaining in cover. The firepower can be at least fairly general purpose. The las cannons want to go into a big tough vehicle ideally. The missiles, ideally something toughness 10 or less, but you might not have that many options. As with a lot of backfield fire support things, you might need to consider pushing him up in the later game to force the opponents to actually deal with his defense and stomp onto mid-board objectives, or just to gain lines of sight if things are hiding. Again, I'd say it's solidly usable as a Space Marine fire support unit as opposed to being standout strong. Lastly, for the Walkers, we have the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, a Phobos Marine piloting a stripped down Redemptor chassis. It gets a scout move, lots of shots to punish enemy infantry, but not really all that much on the defense point of view. It gets a return fire sort of special rule where if enemies shoot at Phobos, it gets to fire right back. For Wargear choices, you have the choice between the Flamestorm Cannon and the Auto Cannon. I'd probably be more tempted by the Auto Cannons with their twin-linked damage 3 overall, though I feel like they're quite well balanced, and I've seen some people prefer the Incendium Cannon. And again, for synergies and things, I probably wouldn't go mad in trying to support this guy too much. Again, he's got one of the special rules where he maybe supports Phobos Marines with the return fire. So if you do happen to be using an army with lots of those, he's going to be a little bit more viable and interesting. For his battle plan to get the most out of him, his only real big advantage versus other things is the scout move. Ideally he needs to deploy so he can either use this to threaten damage on enemies turn 1 or make sure he's hidden completely safe, potentially with the option to move up into a mid-board ruin if the opponent gets first turn perhaps. Otherwise then his weapons are generally best for bullying lighter infantry at range, and then his strength 14 melee can put a bit of a damage on tougher stuff, but is not likely to be soloing battle tanks on his own. And as he's going about his business, if he can just loiter within 6 inches of some Phobos Marines, you might have the opportunity to get a bit more free firepower opportunistically. In general though, I feel like he's a harder unit to get good value out of than most. He's just got really quite a weak defensive profile for his points cost, and doesn't really make up for it with excess damage. The Predator tanks are 130 points each, they get you 11 wounds worth of toughness 10 armour, and both have some okay firepower of one flavour or another. Out of the 2 variants, I've seen the Predator Destructor played a fair bit more. I do feel like that up to 6 shot auto cannon outcompetes the twin las cannon on the Annihilator, particularly with the AP boost against infantry. My go-to loadout would be a Predator Destructor with las cannon sponsons, and that gives you a very general purpose tank that can both deal good damage against enemy vehicles and infantry. I feel like as a cheap and sturdy-ish firebase unit, you could take multiple if you wanted to. Again, as a slightly cheaper unit, I probably wouldn't go too mad in terms of characters and stratagems to support them. I guess you could use a Tech Marine to have it hitting on a 2+, but I feel like there are better targets. I certainly like the Ironstorm Spearhead for the built-in rerolls and the odd powerful vehicle stratagem. And if the enemy is trying to focus one down, then either Smoke or Armour of Contempt could have good value. One big advantage they have is really quite good range. So ideally they want to set up with some good long fire lanes or the ability to move into them pretty quickly, hopefully throwing down some long range anti-tank fire against enemy tanks and armour, and perhaps putting an autocannon to good work against things like 3 wound infantry in the midboard. With effective AP2 against them, they can be rather nasty. Hitting on a 3+, they could be kind of good for Oath of Moment to support them as well, or maybe other Space Marine firepower buffs such as Incursors. They move at least fairly fast as well, so it could be alright to push up and get lines of sight or objective things in the mid to late game. Overall, I feel like they're reasonable enough. For dedicated anti-tank duties, people tend to pay the extra 30 points to upgrade to the Gladiator Lancer, but these are still pretty acceptable for the cost, I think. Next up, we've got the big firepower of the Demolisher Cannon with the Vindicator tank. High toughness with a 2+ save, and d6+3 strength 14 damage d6 shots with that Demolisher Cannon, and the ability to fire in melee happily even if it's locked up. It doesn't really have any significant Wargear options. I'd probably go for 1 or 2 of them as opposed to spamming 3. Again, maybe slightly diminishing returns given movement lanes and its slightly short range. Being a big and scary vehicle with 175 points and a 2+ save, I think you could justify using a Tech Marine to support him more so than others. It perhaps is a vehicle that's a bit more likely to be on the front lines though, so a little bit harder to coordinate if it's surging forwards to get in range with the big gun. Perhaps more than most, they really get on well with the Ironstorm Spearhead. The reroll's good for it. Potentially returning fire could be kind of terrifying, and even the auto-explode could be handy enough if it is being aggressive and firing in melee on mid-board objectives and things. Again, it'll enjoy Oath of Moment or Incursor buffs, and can use Smoke or Armour of Contempt to good effect, particularly with its 2+ save. The main game plan with the Vindicator is going to be to try and coordinate the big gun into range of enemy armour or monsters ideally, though failing that it can still take a good chunk out of heavy infantry with the blast keyword. Ideally it wants to think about what movement lanes it's going to use to get up the board, and ideally tow into cover with the 2+ save as well to reduce a bit of enemy firepower. Given it can shoot quite happily in close combat, you could maybe have a bit more scope for doing annoying nuisance charges with it as well, tying up some enemy lighter infantry, and then continuing to make them suffer if they choose not to fall back. I rank this one as kind of usable to strong. Scary enough firepower and defense for the cost, maybe quite a bit better in Ironstorm Spearhead compared with others though. Those would also like things like Gladius and Firestorm for advance and shoot to get in range. Next up we've got the Space Marine Indirect Fire Tank in the Whirlwind. It's paying quite a premium for its artillery damage at 180 points, though I feel like I slightly have no amazingly strong feelings about how many of them you might run. You could argue that you don't want to have more indirect fire than you need, otherwise the army's damage is going to suffer. But also artillery can have more power once it reaches critical mass, and you know that you can just wipe out one unit of any sort each turn, so you could potentially run more. For support options, probably doesn't need too much and it's just going to be happy to do what it does. If you really thought that the indirect fire was going to be the most impactful thing this turn, maybe on turn 1, you could potentially use Oath of Moment on its targets. They can only hit on a 4+ now thanks to the barrage fire nerf, but that could still have most of its hits landing, and you could have a wound reroll as well from Ironstorm Spearhead. In general, the game plan's likely going to be to hide out of line of sight, maybe on your home field objective if it's possible, and then use its gun profile to either kill very high value and low defense targets, try and wipe out units that can score objectives, or have a shot at trying to finish off some near dead things that literally nothing else can, that will be super impactful to the game if you can just plink that last wound or two. Its gun profile is going to make it pretty effective against anything standard Space Marine level of toughness or weaker. Overall, since the points increase, it's considered a kind of weak data sheet in 40k currently. Games Workshop seems to be wanting to cost artillery, so they're kind of borderline as to whether or not you'd want to take them. Moving on, we've got the Gladiator tanks, and starting out we have the Lancer. 160 points for its enormously scary laser destroyer shots. It gets 2 shots with an inbuilt hit, wound and damage reroll, and then a slightly terrifying d6+3 damage if it does land a wound through. If you're running one of these, people often like to run 2 for redundancy, and making sure there isn't just one big anti-tank threat that enemies can anticipate and hide from. I still don't think 1 is awful though, just to mean that any one enemy tank can't really relax until it's dealt with. In terms of support, given those massive rerolls, it just doesn't really need all that much support from Tech Marines or Oath of Moment or anything like that. Plenty of detachment have some nice support for it, obviously Ironstorm, but Vanguard can help make it a bit more durable at range as well. and the advance and shoot detachments help it better with gaining lines of sight. Definitely could be an option to use Armour of Contempt on as well, particularly if it's in cover in your deployment zone. Even if this survives after being bracketed, it's going to be an absolutely enormous damage threat. Ideally for a game plan, you definitely want to make sure that this gets the shooting before it gets shot. It should be able to do that with its long range, hide behind air ruin or something that blocks line of sight in your deployment zone. Hopefully wait until it can get a strike on one of the enemy units out there and then go for it. If it rolls well, it certainly has the possibility to kill its points worth of enemy tank in a single shooting phase if the stars align. Again, like other backfield fire support, you might need to balance keeping it safe with pushing up and being aggressive to see units and do objective things. Sometimes playing a bit too timid with gun tanks could be punishing in the late game. In any case, they're very strong right now. Rarely going to be a bad option for just about any Space Marine list that wants a little bit more dedicated anti-tank. Next up, we've got the Gladiator Reaper. This one instead packs a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon and gets some serious sustained hits against enemy infantry. With the devastating wounds and the reroll wound rolls, it's actually very efficient both against light infantry and also against the heaviest infantry around, so it can happily chew away at Terminators or Custodies as well as just Hordes. There's no real main Wargear options for it, and for supporting things, again it can do well with normal vehicle stuff. Again, this one's kind of notable for doing particularly good in Ironstorm Spearhead, particularly with the option to trigger some sustained hits on 5s, even if that is really quite an expensive option to trigger now. It could use a Tech Marine to increase damage as well, though I feel like it's a little bit lower value here than elsewhere, and it might kind of outpace the guy who's trying to buff it. In game, again, it wants to be hidden turn 1 if at all possible, and then just hover somewhere around its 24-inch range for the most part, getting line of sight on infantry and whittling away at enemy objective grabbers and damage dealers. It might likely need to play just a little bit more aggressively due to its slightly shorter range, and you could maybe use Strategic Reserve against the right army to be able to get it into strike range really quite reliably turn 2. I'd rate it usable for pure power right now. It went up a little bit to 160 points. The Black Templar version could be interesting as well for its bolt-on multi-melter. Finally, for the Gladiators, we've got the Valiant, the same chassis, but this time having a twin Las Talon and then a bunch of melter weapons. This one gets a little bit better against targeting tough stuff that's closest to it. Again, Ironstorm will do fine for it. Firestorm is maybe another interesting one for this one in particular. Advance and Shoot can help get those short-range multi-melters to their targets, and maybe even get them up to strength 10 if you can get them within 12-inch range. It also could be an interesting unit for using with Vulcan Hestan as well, re-rolling some wounds with those multi-melters. I feel like Black Templars amp this one up a little bit better as well, giving it a third multi-melter to really double down on its main purpose. I feel like using the Gladiator Valiant is a little bit more tricky than some. It does need to be aggressive and push up, otherwise it's going to be a pretty underwhelming twin Las Talon turret. And then get in range of something important for the enemy, some either elite infantry or lighter vehicles. Ideally, if it can park up hidden in terrain in the midboard and then move out to deal some max damage in your turn, that seems best. But I feel like there's usually going to be a good chance of it just getting focused down and being destroyed after that. It just doesn't really have a good enough defensive profile to survive being on the front lines for too long. I still say it's usable though. If the opponent fails to deal with it, it's likely going to cause a lot of carnage with all of that melter and high AP weaponry. Back to some Firstborn armour, and here we have the Land Raiders. Great big toughness 12 beasts with a 2+ save, and the ability to move 10 inches, have a unit drop out, and then that unit can still charge with the assault ramp rule. For choice of Wargear, there's the 3 different variants of Land Raider. The Crusader at 220 points with a massive amount of twin-linked bolt shots, the regular pattern with its 4 las cannons at 240, and the Redeemer at 280. I feel like between that and the transport slots, literally all of them are pretty usable. I feel like maybe still the Land Raider Redeemer might be the biggest and scariest of the lot, despite the points cost of 280. Those Flamestorm cannons are just really savage against medium infantry, and it's got an absolutely crazy overwatch threat. In general, if you're using Land Raiders, they want some sort of big scary melee threat inside it to make use of their very big move drop charge maneuvers. Perhaps the Gladius Task Force with a bunch of aggressors with a fire discipline combo, maybe some Templar Sword Brethren with Helbrecht, perhaps some Blade Guard with Adrax Agatone. Otherwise, for support, they do great with Armour of Contempt and are kind of famously hard to kill, particularly if they're in cover with that. Toughness 12 and a 2+ save is very intimidating there. Overwatch is really big for the Land Raider Redeemer as mentioned. If you can position it so it's got a line of sight to every point on an objective marker, you're going to make it harder for the opponent to take that. I generally rate them as doing pretty well in the vast majority of detachments out there, perhaps the detachment being a little bit more relevant for the stuff inside it, and maybe the Land Raiders as a result being a bit more tempting for armies that don't get to advance and charge. For a rough game plan, they'd need to start at least fairly aggressively to be able to threaten the charge and big damage, certainly making sure they can tow into cover, which will be super easy with such an enormous vehicle. Using Armour of Contempt if it looks seriously like something might threaten to blow them up. And then ideally, when the opponent's got something worthwhile in strike range, move 10 inches, drop units 3 inches out the front, and then go on to charge into glorious close combat. From there, they can just be a massively tanky big threat that can roll up to the midfield objectives and could even do annoying things like charging and rolling over some things on the midboard, maybe using tank shock for an average of 4 mortal wounds perhaps. Overall, I'd say they're really quite strong with the right damage combo inside them. In particular, the Land Raider Redeemer can be really problematic to deal with if the opponent doesn't have something that'll crack it reliably. Next up, we've got the big chunky Primaris tanks. The standard repulsor is 180 points. It doesn't get the 2+ save of the Land Raider, but that's still really quite cheap for that many wounds of toughness 12 armor. It's got a bunch of firepower and a nice rule that allows you to get units back into it once they get charged. As a result, it's a bit better for supporting firepower units as opposed to assault melee ones. And for Wargear choices, I'd probably be more tempted by the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon and then twin las cannons. Though lots of people swap out the Heavy Onslaught for a twin las talon, that's also very good. For support options, it wants a big scary shooting unit inside. I feel like maybe Eradicators with something like an Apothecary Biologist or Fire Discipline combo. Maybe with the Firestorm Assault Force or the Fire Discipline in Gladius could be a particularly nice choice. Maybe similar for Hellblasters, or perhaps could do Aggressors if you're keeping the focus on their shooting in Gladius or Firestorm. When it's moving up, both Armour of Contempt and Smoke could be really big deals, particularly if the enemy is trying to take it down with sort of mid-AP style weapons. And as a big chunky vehicle, there's lots of things that you could do to support it. I feel like its emphasis is going to be on shielding its contents and allowing that to get the first strike, and then maybe defending them when they get charged and can jump back into it to hopefully guarantee they survive for another one. Otherwise, while it's doing that, it can just provide its fire support to thin out enemy infantry and put a few big shots into tough stuff. And it's also got quite a lot of objective control as well, which could contribute to things on the midfield. Overall, for the 180 points, I think it's pretty solid. Certainly a staple in certain competitive lists. I've seen a lot of people using them in Dark Angels Gladius currently. Next up, we've got the gun variant of the same thing in the Repulsor Executioner. This one costs a bit more and sacrifices transport capacity for a really big gun. Out of the two, I'd be more tempted to take the Heavy Laser Destroyer over the Macroplasma Incinerator and just go all in on the scary anti-tank. As one of the single biggest and scariest gun tanks the Space Marines can field, this one's good with just about any synergies that you can give it. Defensive ones like Armour of Contempt and Smoke are both great on a huge vehicle. I'd say it's one of the best things to support with a Tech Marine given the 2+ ballistic skill, or using Oath of Moment or Incursors to make it shoot straighter. The Laser Destroyer could be hitting on a 2+ if it's static, but often in 40k you're going to need to move to gain line of sight or just to better reposition, so I feel like the damage buffs there are still pretty relevant for it. It's one of the best vehicles for Ironstorm Spearhead in my opinion as well. The rerolls do well with the Heavy Laser Destroyer, and the stratagems are about as easy to justify as they are anywhere on this. And he could potentially make use of its transport capacity to, say, put something threatening inside, maybe a trio of Eradicators, or even just some cheap Assault Intercessors to grab objectives. Things like Vanguard can help it out with a bit more defense at range, and Gladius and Firestorm can help with advance and shoot as well. For an overall battle plan, it needs to be treated as a big high investment unit that it is, ideally staying safe enough from enemy firepower and then moving out to hit things hard first, hopefully shooting something meaningful every turn if possible, and maybe judging just how aggressive you can afford to play with it. Depending on what sort of anti-tank weapons the enemy has, some things can kill them a bit surprisingly easily, where a lot of things really struggles with just this many wounds and toughness. The big profile might be a little bit harder to hide than most things in the deployment zone, so you'd have to think about deployment kind of carefully and sort of prioritise this, and then play the usual balance between ranged units. Do you push up to make sure their guns are still relevant, but also don't get them killed too early? Overall, I feel like it's at least fairly strong and hard to go too far wrong with a great big armoured thing covered in massive guns. Certainly a bit of a staple in Ironstorm lists, and does fine enough in other places too. For the Space Marine Super Heavy, we've got the Astrius, this one in the Forge World Index. 525 points gets you a 30 wound, 2+ save vehicle, a big cannon with lots of shots but AP 1 and damage 3, and then some pretty savage sponsons. I feel like the sponson guns are at least fairly well balanced between anti-elite plasma and anti-tank last shots. I feel like I could happily go for either of those really. And for support, as an absolutely enormous vehicle, it would want a Tech Marine to hit on a 2+. That's likely to be more value than virtually anything else. and if anything does try and bring down this mighty beast, again Armour of Contempt is going to have unusually good value on a 2+ save that should almost certainly be getting cover from somewhere on that huge hull. Basically any buffs and stratagems that can make it more dangerous are going to be massive value here, again massively in Ironstorm Spearhead. Perhaps its main disadvantage is that its primary weapon with that macro accelerator cannon is that it has kind of low AP as well, so things that could either provide extra AP or ignore cover, whether they're stratagems or other units, are going to be a bit better here than elsewhere. It could be worth thinking about pairing with a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike perhaps. In terms of game plan, the enormous hull that it has means that it's really limited on certain battlefields. In some tournament games it can make it kind of unusable on certain preset terrain layouts, so ideally you want to play it in games where you actually know that you've got a good chance of being able to move it where it wants to. As a great big enormous centerpiece unit, it really needs to be firing at something important basically every turn, and again playing the same game as the Repulsor of not getting killed instantly if the opponent has capacity to do so, but also not really playing too cagey. A lot of armies will really struggle to deal with all of this armour in one solid mass. Overall, between its terrain issues and having low AP on the main gun and the overall points cost for the thing, it's generally considered that multiple smaller vehicles will do better than one great big Astreus. I've not really seen them played in tournament lists at all in 10th edition. Next up we have the Storm Speeders, 3 different variants with their own special rules and damage profiles, between 130 and 160 points depending on variant. For more competitive lists, the Thunderstrike one tends to be the far more commonly played. That one has a bit of longer ranged anti-tank damage that hits on a 2+, and has a rather nice debuff rule where you can get +1 to wound against enemy monsters and vehicles, and that can make some general purpose firepower things like say Strength 8 Hellblasters or Redemptor Macroplasmas pretty much good against everything, both elite infantry and tougher stuff. The others don't tend to be played quite as much. The Hammer Strike's ignore cover is fairly good, but paying 150 points for that and a unit that really wants to be getting close to actually make use of its good damage just don't make it very easy to use. And the Hailstrike's AP debuff is good in the right matchup, but sometimes it's going to be near useless, and its damage output with a bunch of low AP shooting leaves a lot to be desired. In general, you'd want to be putting them on the board to support things as opposed to the other way around, and they're more likely to be justified if you're playing an army that's got a whole load of range damage, maybe occasionally making an appearance in things like Ironstorm lists with a lot of vehicle shooting. Several detachments can help a bit, but maybe it's not really their primary focus. For a battle plan, they want to be making very good use of terrain, given that they've got alright damage but very weak defense. They want to be hiding behind terrain, and moving up with that good 14-inch movement to get the first strike on something, and more importantly put their special rule exactly where it's most needed. Hopefully if they can do that without exposing themselves to literally the entire enemy army, then that'll be preferable. And hopefully they can't bring enough guns to bear on them to just one-round them and shoot them straight down. Overall, I'd probably rate the Thunderstrike best, Hammerstrike sort of mid, and Hailstrike a bit niche. They don't tend to be all that common picks in more optimised Space Marine armies. Next up, we've got a couple of Space Marine flyers. First up, the Stormraven gunship. 280 points for a fairly meaty flyer with a bunch of wounds and -1 damage. It can transport a bunch of Marines, including a Dreadnought, and for Wargear it gets some nice Hurricane bolters and missiles, and on top of that people quite like the twin heavy plasma cannons, which are quite nice and general purpose, maybe backed up by some twin multi-melters on the nose-mounted gun. After having multiple points increases, I feel like Storm Ravens can be usable, but only in the exact right army list. Dark Angels can get more value out of them using the Ravenwing Dark Shrouds to get them cover and -1 to hit. And with access to Armour of Contempt, that probably takes them from a unit that lots of armies that can kill in one round of shooting to a lot of armies struggling to do so, and maybe the same for Vanguard Spearhead with that. As a big scary vehicle with a lot of guns, Ironstorm has a bunch of stratagems that can work quite well with it. And if you're taking one, I'd probably make use of its transport capacity, maybe having a Redemptor Dreadnought to slingshot into battle, and perhaps some other scary Space Marine shooting units that you can have it deploy turn 1. In game against the majority of armies, I'd likely use the hover mode to lose the aircraft keyword, which means that you could hide it behind ruins and things, and then it's got a massive 20-inch move to be able to deliver its embarked threats up the board. With that, hopefully you should be able to do a pretty powerful alpha strike between things within it, a Dreadnought profile, and all the Storm Ravens guns. I feel like you'd really need to make that strike absolutely as devastating as possible though, as all the stuff is likely going to get hit back hard if the enemy goes after it. Maybe with Armour of Contempt and perhaps some detachment buffs, there's at least some chance it might not just get shot down again immediately. For the most part though, they became far less fashionable after the Ironstorm Spearhead got nerfed. Otherwise, for Storm planes, we've got the Stormhawk and Storm Talon, the smaller fighter style aircraft. Either you've got the Storm Talon that gets 2 guns and can hover and start on the board, or the Stormhawk that gets 3 guns. but has to go aircraft mode and start off the board. The Stormhawk is better against fly things, and the Storm Talon's better against ground. For loadouts, I feel like different things can work, but maybe Las Talon, Typhoon, and Assault Cannon for the Stormhawk, and perhaps Twin Las or Typhoon for the Storm Talon. For the most part, I'd say they're not really worth supporting with stratagem so much, though a couple of detachments could help them out a little bit. Again, Ironstorm's going to be more relevant than most. It maybe could be an interesting unit to use the auto-explode if they do decide to fly in and just threaten that in the midst of the enemy army. For the Storm Talon, I'd likely go to hover mode, try and hide it, and then get the first strike with its 20-inch move. Hopefully she'll be able to deal a bit of damage and not take too much enemy fire in return in the right place on the board. For the Stormhawk, it's going to need to set up off the board, and then when it comes in from reserves turn 2, it needs to point in the direction where it's going to fly next turn, and hopefully bring its damage to bear on some heavier infantry or lighter vehicles. Out of the two, I'd probably say the Stormhawk's the more interesting one versus the Storm Talon, as it actually has a bit more damage output and is a bit cheaper. It does come with the aircraft disadvantages, but it has got the interesting ability to fire over line of sight blocking terrain, which could give it some interest on the Alpha Strike. In general though, both of these are considered kinda weak and rarely seen in competitive armies. For the biggest baddest flyer of the lot though, we've got the Thunderhawk gunship, a massive, great, big and expensive Forge World model that's more aimed at casual games than any sort of optimised army list, but it's just kind of fun that you can put it on the board. For Wargear choices, I'd go for the Hellstrike missiles over the cluster bombs, which are a bit clunky to use, and the big turbo laser destructor over the heavy cannon for me, just so you can put some crazy hurt on one big tough target. I think that's probably going to have more value overall. Again, like the Astrius, literally for any support options that can help with it, are likely to be more efficient here than other places given such a crazy big unit with lots of guns. Armour of Contempt will help its defence. It can make great value out of any damage dealing stratagems like some of the ones from Ironstorm. A Tet Marine could have it hit on a 2+, though it's likely to outpace them really quickly unless it's just hovering in one place being a big gun turret on the board. And if you're using one, you might well just want to use its transport capacity, use it as a big fun melee delivery tool, and then have a bunch of jump infantry being able to jump out of it and charge straight away. So you could have a 20-inch, drop some units, and then those units can still charge. Could be a fun way to throw a bunch of jump intercessors or Vanguard veterans at people at least. The Vanguard detachment or Ravenwing Darkshroud could give it cover and stealth, and again that's probably quite worth it, similar to the Storm Raven. I think to play with one, I'd ideally want to push it on the board turn 1 rather than have too many points off the board and have to broadcast its location with the aircraft rules. Maybe try and hide from the absolute nastiest anti-tank guns out there, but it's probably going to find that hard with its enormous profile, and then ideally needs to be trying to kill something important basically every turn to justify 840 points worth of massive units. In reality, it's going to make a lot more sense to take lots of smaller vehicles if you do want crazy massive firepower. Definitely a bit more of a datasheet aimed for fun and fluff, and because it's a core model that exists as opposed to being a serious competitive model. Next up, we've got the transport vehicles of the Space Marines. First up, we have the Rhino tank, your standard issue metal box with 10 wounds at toughness 9. It can self-repair a little bit, have some Space Marines fire out of the firing deck, though is locked to basically just transporting firstborn units. From the core codex, that'd just be Tactical Marines and Devastators there, and I guess you could have some heavy weapons fire out of the top hatch if it made sense. In reality though, I don't feel like either of those are particularly strong choices for it. You might be better currently with Space Wolves with a bunch of Bloodclaws and Auric the Slayer, or maybe Firstborn Crusaders for the Black Templars. Transports are mainly about durability, so I wouldn't really invest much in it beyond that, besides perhaps Smoke or Armour of Contempt, if it is going to make a difference with it surviving and its cargo surviving. For detachment and synergies and things, Firestorm also gets better with a lot of transport types, particularly for any shooting units you might put inside one. In general, its battle plan is going to depend on the unit being transported a bit, but generally speaking, moving it up somewhere in cover or even out of line of sight in the midboard is reasonable enough, and then using it as a bit of a battlefield bunker to stage charges out of or get out and shoot. If it makes sense, any heavy weapons could potentially take some pot shots out of the top hatch, which could help a little. And then after it's dropped its cargo, it can still be annoying, a nice durable unit that can sit on primary objectives, nuisance charge stuff, or screen, or maybe do the odd secondary objective perhaps. With its good defense for the points, the opponent's likely going to be wasting their time trying to deal with it to some extent. Overall, as a unit in itself, there's nothing really too wrong with it. Just from the core codex, it's got very limited options that aren't considered too strong right now to be able to transport. Otherwise, we have the Razorback. For 20 points more than the Rhino, you get to bolt a big gun on top, though it does cost some fire points. and only being able to transport smaller units. For the guns, I'd go with the twin las cannon over the twin heavy bolters, and for transport occupants, I'd be most tempted by devastators, probably with multi-melters out of this one. The Razorback has a special rule where if it targets the same unit as the squad getting out of it, then that squad will be able to get reroll wound rolls, which is exactly what multi-melters want in the midboard. Between the two, it works pretty nicely with Devastator squads, allowing those multi-melters to get in range and then hit far harder against tough stuff when they do so. More so in Firestorm Assault Force as well, where all those melter goodness could be strength 10. Then after that, it can just go around the board being a durable nuisance unit similar to the Rhino, albeit with one with a big scary gun on top that might occasionally do something good. Again, I'd say it's probably on the kind of usable to niche sort of side. Again, doesn't really help that it doesn't have too many options in terms of things to transport in it. And I feel like maybe 95 points really is pricing in the reroll to wound roll that it gets, so I feel like you need to make very good use out of that if you want to justify this over the Rhino. For the Primaris Battlefield Taxi, we have the Hovering Impulsor, a transport capacity of 7 now, open topped so you can blaze away out of the back of it, and the ability to advance and drop things if it makes sense to. For the common main upgrades that it gets to choose from, it's got 4 options. Generally the ones that get taken are the missile launcher for a bit of general purpose firepower, or shield dome for a 5+ invulnerable save, both of which I rate as okay but not hugely stand out. Often you might not need the invulnerable if it gets cover. And the missile launcher is alright, but isn't going to change the world most of the time. Beyond that, both Fragstorm or Stormbolters I think do okay. I maybe slightly prefer the Stormbolters of the two, but not by much. For transport options, I think lots of things are pretty viable, and that expanded with the transport capacity going to 7 strong. As for the core codex, Hellblasters can do quite well, taking the hazardous checks on the transport itself if they fire from inside it, and otherwise lots of melee things will do really well. Black Templar Sword Brethren with a character attached, Space Marine Blade Guard, maybe with a Lieutenant or Judaseer, and maybe an Inner Circle Companion Squad with Azrael or Judaseer or something similar. They can all be very nasty to jump out of the cheap transport and go breaking stuff with power swords. You could use cheaper things like troops units in it as well. Blood Angels often get on well with things like Assault Intercessors and Captains in them. For the most part though, if you got cheaper troop units, it often might make a bit more sense just to foot slog them up and take more of them. Again, transports are going to get on well with Armour of Contempt, as being fast and durable is their main thing, and the Impulsor in particular feels like it gets on really quite well with Firestorm for lots of options for shooting. Being able to advance and drop and still fire all of its shots is kind of fun. I feel like in that one you could also use Infernus Marines in the transport as well if you wanted. Black Templars also get a bit more value out of it than some given the bolt-on multi-melter. As with the other transports, it likely wants to move up to the midfield, then be a battlefield bunker for the scary squads to get out and shoot or charge out of. And then compared with the firstborn transports, can still be a very tough unit to go around and do annoying things on objectives, maybe with a little bit more firepower if you happen to have taken the missile. Overall, I'd say they're usable enough, can be strong in the right army list, maybe in particular with certain Divergent chapter veterans like Sword Brethren or Inner Circle. For some Space Marines raining from the sky, we've got a drop pod, 70 points for a 10 occupant transport that can take Tacticus Marines and then deploy them from Deep Strike turn 1 if you want to. It gets the choice of a Stormbolter versus a Deathwind launcher that I both think are kind of whatever really. I feel like on paper drop pods could be usable enough with a bunch of units, maybe Hellblasters being an obvious one for high value Tacticus shooting, Sternguard could do okay, Infernus Marines like to get close as well, so maybe particularly good for them. Perhaps things like Devastator squads if you wanted to cram in maximal heavy weapons. It can be a bit awkward with transport sizes though, given that you only have 10 slots, so if you wanted a character attached to one of those units for even more efficiency, you would actually have to drop one of the models, which you can do, but that does also lessen the efficiency as well. Perhaps Infernus Marines could be an interesting one with Vulcan Hestan somewhere. It perhaps means that you could have a full squad of 10 of them dropping down and unload all of those flamethrower weapons, and Vulcan Hestan mark the unit for reroll wound rolls. For the game plan, it'll be starting in reserve. I'd strongly consider dropping it turn 1, given the main point of it is the sort of tax to bring in things turn 1 from Deep Strike. And then when it drops somewhere, ideally dropping the pod itself within range of a midfield objective wouldn't be the worst idea. At least that way it means that there's just a little bit more objective control on the point, and your opponents have an annoying thing that they actually have to deal with, maybe netting you some victory points if they don't. But also bear in mind the disadvantages of it being an immobile unit. Potentially enemies could hide in melee with it and stop you shooting them. That could be quite relevant against some very heavy melee armies. Overall, I'd say it's maybe a little bit niche, perhaps a bit of a tax at that 70 points for what it does. Definitely not unusable though, and can be fun with certain combos. Finally, for the vehicle style units, we've got the Hammerfall bunker, 175 points for a big tough 2+ save, toughness 12 fortification, armed with some missiles and heavy bolters with a chance to get a free overwatch. I probably would go with the heavy bolters as opposed to the heavy flamers, as otherwise I feel like there's just a reasonable chance that it just never gets to fire them all game unless the opponent deliberately chooses to move within range of it. And then ideally it just wants to be set up somewhere with good lines of sight as it can't move, and hopefully cause some casualties on the enemy as they move up the board. I guess for detachment things, you could have it hitting on a 3+ with Anvil, as it usually hits on a 4, and Vanguard could make it even tougher to kill at range, though it's already kind of adequately tough. It does provide cover as well, so maybe could be useful for having a little bit easier cover saves with the Space Marine army in your deployment zone, though usually cover in 40k isn't the hardest thing to come by. With its free Overwatch thing, I bear in mind that you're allowed to use it as an extra free Overwatch, but if it uses the Overwatch first, then something else wouldn't be able to. Could just be worth thinking about that when you're deciding what shoots where. Though without any rules that buff the Overwatch, it does mean that it's only probably landing like 2 heavy bolter hits or something on enemy units moving up. Overall, for 175 points and being immobile, it's just a bit weak without enough damage to justify its cost. One of many fortifications that Games Workshop just seem to want to keep super niche in 10th edition and not make into a strong unit. Finally, for the Space Marines, let's talk characters. I will start off with the standard heroes themselves in the Space Marine Captains. There's 5 different flavours of these, ranging in points from 80 to 95-ish. Some have Wargear options and some don't. Generally, Power Fists tend to be a good idea when they can be taken. For the Gravis one, I might be tempted to take the Relic Power Blade as its extra attacks. The different rules that specific ones have vary slightly, though typically they want to be run with big threatening melee units, so they can use their own pretty good combat powers, and then also give them some free stratagems as well, whether it's for generic ones or some detachment to specific stuff. Things like Blade Guard, Aggressors, Terminators, or Assault Intercessors can all do quite well with them. The Assault Intercessor's nice for the on-foot captain, as they can potentially mean that they get to reroll wound rolls with Power Fist and things. And they can be a good choice for getting enhancements in certain units, things like the Firestorm Automatic 6s one, the Blood Angels Fights First once per game one, or maybe the Gladius Honor Vehement as a points filler perhaps. Generally captains tend to be the best idea if you've got a big central damage dealer combo and you've got stratagems that you absolutely know that you want to use on them. Maybe say the Devastating Wound Torrent one on Flamestorm Aggressors in Firestorm, or Blood Angels, where you're likely to want to use Red Rampage perhaps. But there's loads of great options. Armour of Contempt is always a staple. It can be nice to get a free reroll on charges if you unexpectedly fail. Overwatch could chip in a bit of damage, and being able to interrupt combat or heroic intervene essentially for free both could catch the opponent out as well. For the on-foot one, I'd be tempted to use the +3 attack buff sooner rather than later for the more mainline one. Next up, we've got the Lieutenants that give you lethal hits onto your units, so 6s to hit auto wound. I thought that given the similarity in what they do, I'd also lump in the Apothecary Biologist here, as at least rules-wise in all but name is pretty much the Lieutenant for the Gravis Marines. Again, there's a few different variant options for Phobos and stuff. The Phobos ones and the Apothecary don't have any choices, but for the standard Tacticus one, probably Power Fists are best, or maybe the Sword and Shield loadout from the Indomitors type one. That could be another solid choice for a bit more durability. These guys tend to be really solid pickups for any big threatening units with a sort of mid to lower strength, and that tends to encompass just about every Space Marine unit they can lead really. Blade Guard veterans with good AP and damage but low strength 5, aggressors with mid strength weapons, Hellblasters with spam strength 8, or even Eradicators only get strength 9 at base, even if they do get some nice wound rerolls against their best targets. The Phobos and Reaver Lieutenants tend to be a bit less favoured for their damage buff rules, just because the units that they're buffing tend to have lower damage strength 4 attacks with damage 1. Having such a unit with a big damage boost often means it's going to be one of your central combos that should be able to take out the biggest and best of the enemy squads. So then the challenge is to be able to deliver that into melee or into shooting range without it getting destroyed first, so things like transports can often be a good idea. Maybe things like Blade Guard with a Lieutenant jumping out for an Impulsor, or Boltstorm Aggressors with a Fire Discipline, Apothecary Biologist jumping out of a Land Raider. It can also be an interesting option to go alongside named characters and chapter masters, such as Calgar or Adrax Agatone, and it can be one way in which you can combo special characters with enhancements as well, say for example infiltrating Calgar in Vanguard Spearhead, or just making Adrax Agatone and Blade Guard into a ridiculously terrifying unit. For the lethal hits, they generally matter a lot more against things that you'd be wounding on a 5+, and they sort of smooth things out, as units are already going to be quite efficient against things that they wound on a 3, but far less so against things they're wounding on 5s most of the time, so it means that a lot of things will take some big chunks to get out of monsters and vehicles, even if they might not kill one in a single round. As a result, they're likely going to want to tangle with the enemy's heavy hitters, try and take down the biggest stuff that they have in the army, and then if possible remain as safe as they can, but ideally getting the first strike either with movement shenanigans or transports. Overall, they tend to be really quite strong picks, pretty much regardless of detachment. It's hard to go too far wrong with adding lethal hits to an already fairly threatening unit. The Combi Weapon Lieutenant needs a special mention really, as he just operates completely differently. 70 points for the Space Marine Lone Operative from Leviathan. He doesn't have any Wargear options or anything, but he could be good for keeping certain enhancements safe, like Master of Machine War in Ironstorm, or potentially taking durability relics such as a 2+ armor save, which can make him even more weirdly tanky. In general, I wouldn't want to invest too much in terms of stratagems or other support to him. His damage isn't really up to much, it's mainly just interesting as a lone operative that the opponent can't interact with to mess around on objectives. He's got his reactive move special rule, which means that if you can set him up in an area where the enemy is going to move into, he could potentially just ghost away from them. Ideally, if he's next to line of sight blocking terrain, just jumping to the other side of it or backpedaling from combat could make him seriously hard for the enemy to catch up and kill. You could maybe combo him with the Primarch to trigger their can't shoot me rule, and does chip in with a little bit of command style damage, as you get to choose one objective in the midboard for reroll ones to wound against them, which while it's not exactly much, usually doesn't hurt at all. In general, he can be a little bit of a less obvious one to play well, but small nuisance units like him have a whole load of value all of their own, doing secondary objectives, grabbing primaries and safety, or screening out areas of the board from deep strikers. In general, he tends to be considered fairly strong in tournament lists and things for the 70 points. Next up, we have the Space Marine Psychers in the Librarians, 3 different flavours of them in the On Foot one, Terminator one, and the Phobos one. They're between 65 and 75 points and all do quite different things. The On Foot one provides a 4+ invulnerable save and a bit of smiting psychic damage. I feel like he's broadly a little bit mid really, could be okay on Hellblasters to make them a little bit more durable, though given that you're sinking a lot more points into the unit it means they're not necessarily any more durable per point, or I guess could go with Inner Circle Companions to give them a 4+ invulnerable save as well. I guess means that your fancy damage dealers won't be getting hit back quite as hard on the strike back, though it does come at the expense of taking a character that would actually directly buff their damage output. The Terminator one gives you sustained hits, so just an all-round slightly more dangerous Terminator squad. I may be more tempted by the ranged Terminator squad, and it sort of feels like it gives the overall threat of just making them a bit more scary at range versus melee, given that he also chips in with his psychic shooting. And then the Phobos one can be an interesting option with infiltrators, as mentioned earlier. It makes the unit a lot more big investment, but it means that they'll both deny deep strike and won't be able to be shot at long range, meaning that you could be a bit more brave with how they spread out and deny that deep strike potentially, and just super hard for the opponents to take down in any reasonable way unless they've got things that move insanely fast. I'd probably put them all in the sort of usable camp as opposed to strong though, maybe the Phobos one being the one that crops up the most in competitive lists, though even then people more tend to run infiltrators without him than with. Next up we've got the Chaplains. They provide good leadership, a +1 to wound in melee, and chip in a bit themselves with their Crozius Arcanums. The standard one on foot is handy enough with Blade Guard, Foot's Death Company, or maybe Primaris Crusader squads. The +1 to wound can be handy to help them punch up better against tough stuff. I feel like he does have a bit of competition against lieutenants for things like Blade Guard though. The 2 buffs with lethal hits and +1 to wound kind of work out to be fairly similar. The Terminator one is nice with mid-strength Power Fist or Thunder Hammers, and also allows you a bit of protection against mortal wounds, which definitely doesn't hurt on them. Both the Stormbolter and Storm Shield seem kind of fine and not the biggest impact for Wargear selections, and overall it just skews the squad to be a bit more melee focused. They can also be quite good with Deathwing Knights with their power weapons too. The Bite Chaplain feels like he's a bit let down by the Outriders themselves maybe. He does make them more dangerous with devastating wound shooting and the +1 to wound in melee, but just the overall value investment of the squad just still gives you something that's going to be far more better against brawling it with lighter infantry, as opposed to taking down tough stuff, and for 250 odd points that just feels a little bit underwhelming. He could be used to bear Stormlance enhancements though, and could be another character to use things in the Ravenwing detachment, though I feel like he's often outcompeted by the Ravenwing command squads there. Then finally we've got the Jump Chaplain, really quite nice with Jump Death Company, new and old, and could work fine with Vanguard Veterans or Jump Intercessors if you built out a big squad of 10 of those, though I'd probably leave off if you're taking just a normal squad of 5 of them. For those ones, I'd certainly be tempted to take the Power Fist though, for a bit of added AP and higher strength in the fight. Overall, between all that, I'd rate the vast majority of them as usable. There may be a bit more for certain armies than others. I feel like I've seen them a bit more for things like Crusader squads for the Templars and Death Company for Blood Angels, as opposed to more generally, but lots of them could be an absolutely reasonable choice for the right units. Next up, we've got the Judas here, the chaplain in training with the Executioner Greatblade. He adds Fight First to his unit and also has some precision attacks with devastating wounds. He seems to be really quite fashionable at the moment to lead Inner Circle companions in Dark Angels Gladius, and is often there in one of their strongest builds. Just very intimidating to have a Tactica squad that's got enough damage to take down a lot of things out there in the game, and if you charge them they'll get to hit you first, and they're pretty terrifying for heroic intervention as well, as they could swoop in and destroy a charging squad before it's even been able to do its damage. Otherwise, Blade Guard perhaps one of the better choices in Codex Marines. I feel like 6 of them and a Judas here into an Impulsor could be perfectly reasonable. Setting up on a mid-board objective, ideally if possible somewhere where the enemy is going to have to try and deal with them by charging into them, as opposed to being able to shoot them to death from long range. Getting behind some terrain could be good for that. Otherwise, sometimes the precision could be worth bearing in mind if a chance comes up to behead the right character. And he could do clever positioning to actually deliberately be able to threaten heroic intervention, maybe with some melee units working closely together with each other. That could make an entire Space Marine formation pretty problematic to charge for some enemies. I think I'd rate him as merely usable for most Space Marine armies. He does seem to be really quite strong in Dark Angels right now though, with those companions. I feel like Black Templar Sword Brethren can also make some good use out of him too. Next up, we've got Space Marine Tech Support with the Tech Marine, giving some blessings of the Omnissiah to chapter vehicles, the Primaris one not having any options other than to take certain detachment-specific enhancements like an Ironstorm. He just comes with a Heavy Bolter, Grav Pistol, and a fun rule that if a vehicle nearby him gets slain, he gets more attacks with his axe. He does have the option to lead a squad, though usually I just take advantage of the lone operative protection he gets when he's within 3 inches of vehicles, and stand next to an appropriate one, giving it +1 to hit and healing D3 wounds per turn. Perhaps for best vehicle choices out of the core codex, the Repulsor Executioner, Redemptor Dreadnought, and Vindicator feel like some of the best. All of those feel suitably high value enough to be worth it. Nice tough wounds to be able to be restored, and value the +1 to hit a bit more than certain other things that get inbuilt rerolls. Ideally, I think you might want multiple of those type vehicles in the army list, just so that if it just gets shot down early in the game, he isn't going to be completely useless in terms of buffs from then on. Tech Marines pretty much also include staples in Ironstorm as a result. We're likely to be using multiple of those vehicles, and there are certain enhancements that only they can bear. The one that allows you to change the damage results to be 0 is really quite big, and that one's pretty much guaranteed to make its points back pretty quickly. I'd say the other ones are kind of fine, even if their utility was reduced a bit. In general, they should be fairly safe to hang around big vehicles for the +1 to hit and some repairs, contribute a bit of chip damage at range. They could be a small unit for doing actions potentially while they do that, or even just be a pretty much guaranteed safe unit to tow onto primary objectives, maybe a home field one, and can stand entirely in the open if the opponent doesn't have units they can move within 12 inches of him. If his vehicle charges get slain, he can actually countercharge surprisingly hard as well with that plus attacks type rule, at least far harder than you'd expect for a 55-point support character. Overall, I'd rate them as strong provided you've got those certain vehicles in the army list. If you've got enough of those similar sort of things, then he's well worth including, and can work with plenty of other stuff as well. If not though, then he probably won't be. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Banner Bearers in the Ancients. Aside from the ones in the Company Hero Command Squad, there's 3 other standard variants of them, a regular one on foot, the Blade Guard pattern one, and the Terminator one. The one on foot is 50 points, likely wants the power sword option of the things and adds a bit of objective control to his unit, and also will protect against battle shock as you still get OC1 as you add on his buff after the objective control characteristic has gone to 0. For 50 points, I just don't really think that that's quite enough as a support character versus what just about anything else could use. And I feel like the Blade Guard Ancient is actually the stronger version of him, even if he is at 45 points and lacks any sort of power weapon. Blade Guard are the sort of unit that's likely to be scrapping over the mid-board objectives and don't have that much OC, and while he personally might only contribute a few AP0 attacks in melee, the fact that he can give you +1 attack on the entire squad once per game I think outweighs that. That's a whole bunch more strength 5 and damage 2 attacks, so it can make them genuinely way more threatening the first time they make combat at least. Being dead cheap at 45 points doesn't hurt as well, and stays more in the usable sort of category. Otherwise, the Terminator one does see some competitive play as well, 75 points, and his damage buff could be relevant for bigger Terminator squads, a bit more likely to be damaged but not destroyed outright with their good armour. I'd probably be most tempted by the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield combo for him out of his weapon options, and he could bear things like the Dark Angel's Pennant of Remembrance, or be a handy place for other enhancements in a threatening unit. In general though, I feel like, compared with some of the reliable value of a bunch of other characters, they're a bit more on the weak to usable sort of side of things. Sometimes objective control really matters, a lot of the time it really doesn't though, as the squad either gets wiped out, or you would have had enough objective control anyway to still win it, and often you might just have been better with a more threatening character, or using the points towards another squad elsewhere. Finally, for our mainline units, we have the Apothecary, the Space Marine Medic and Gene Seed Recoverer, who can get Marines up from the dead, restoring one model to life each turn in a depleted squad, and also giving you a chance to farm a command point if his entire bodyguard gets wiped out, as a bit of a consolation prize, I guess. In general, Hellblasters seem to be the best suited place for him, as they're likely to cause some casualties on their own squad, and therefore you'll have some chip damage to heal, even if the opponent doesn't target them. I feel like he's a bit questionable even there really, and just feels a little bit extra. Most other squads as well are either likely to just outright die, or just not be that worth reviving models to the tune of 50 points. Say if you're reviving a 20-point Space Marine, that's still going to be 3 revivals before he is paid off for himself, at least in theory land anyway. You also at least have a pretty reasonable chance the opponent just absolutely dunks on the unit once it gets exposed, and then you just lose all of them in one go, and he never has a chance to heal anything. And from the core codex he can't join any 3-wound infantry models, which might have been the better place for him with Blade Guard, and even when he can for say Sword Brethren or Inner Circle Companions, you're often going to want to have other characters that can just help them do what they do a bit better, as opposed to trying to patch a couple of them together. If trying to make him work though, I would probably go with a Hellblaster squad, and just go about them doing what they do and not compromising what their battle plans are too much, and then if they happen to take damage and not get wiped out overall, then hopefully you can put some plasma incinerators back on the board, something that would be quite painful for the opponent as they can shoot when they die. In general though, I haven't really seen anyone using Apothecaries in competitive lists pretty much all edition. I put them on the weak to maybe scraping into usable sort of side of things. In any case, with the generic characters talked about, that just about brings us to the end of this one. As mentioned earlier, I'll be aiming to do this as a part 1 and part 2. I'll hopefully aim to follow up with every epic hero in the main codex in a later video. That one should hopefully be a little bit shorter than this behemoth though. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Warhammer Combat Cards for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like a 40k themed mobile game to fill a bit of spare time. I mentioned a bit about the general idea earlier, though I thought I'd also run through a few positives and negatives as well. I've played the game a bit, and they were more than happy with me talking about the things that I liked and the things that I disliked. The things I enjoyed about it, I do quite like the sense of constant progression, which makes things feel a little bit less pressures and chance to go backwards. I think that's usually quite nice in a mobile game, where I don't want to be too stressed if anything goes wrong in any one game. The actual playthroughs of the game are fairly short and punchy, somewhere around the 3 to 5 minute sort of mark, and I do quite like the way that there's some genuine strategy there, different builds to try out that you could build around the different warlords and things, and a little bit of scope for more intelligent play, trying to match up certain cards against favourable other ones, whether it's for abilities or for damage multipliers going into each other. Obviously it's very much not going to be for everyone though. It's a mobile free-to-play game with all that entails. I'd go in expecting a little bit of fun and entertainment and not thinking it's going to be the next Space Marine 2 or anything. I feel like the actual gameplay strategy is maybe a tiny bit limited. I'd say it's a bit more about thinking about building decks as opposed to always necessarily being able to swing the outcome depending on how you play stuff. It can be a bit grindy to level up cards and things, though it's not really something I'm hugely against in a mobile game, particularly when you can do so kind of as much as you want really. And of course there's the obligatory microtransaction shop that I've personally not used on principle. As with a lot of similar mobile games, it's not really pay to win, but it's probably pay to succeed easier, so I'm perfectly happy just to use the things that I unlock on the free mode. It does need internet connection to function as well, and there's occasional reports of glitching and freezing as well, tending to fare far worse on PC than on mobile from online reviews I've seen. In any case, could be of interest to some of you 40k gamers out there. They do seasonal content that lines up with Games Workshop's release schedule, such as having the Lion and the Dark Angels arrive when their codex came out in early 2024. With all that, they've built up more than enough content to keep people occupied, almost 900 cards in play, and have occasional balance patches. In any case, a thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out in the links down in the video description. And as mentioned, if you use the Auspex code, you get some extra cards plus some plasma and coins and things. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and insights as to the Space Marine units out there. I certainly look forward to hearing any other takes and any other fun ways to use them. And hopefully I'll follow up with that next character video in the not too distant future. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. And if you'd like to help and support keep the videos coming and things, I would just like to mention there's the channel's Patreon down in the video description below, with a few other fun things like seeing certain videos early, entry to the monthly prize giveaways, and a few other bits like names in the credits and things. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening though, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.